The basement door had barely closed when I heard the lock click above my head. I spun around, my heart pounding wildly. "Daniel?" I called my son's name, my voice trembling. There was no answer. Only my daughter-in-law's voice floated down, cold and flat. "Just stay down there, the doctor's on the way." Before I could even understand what was happening, my husband leaned close to my ear and whispered something that sent a chill straight through me. "Don't panic. They don't know what's hidden behind that wall." I followed his gaze, and for the first time after 46 years of marriage, I realized I had never truly known the man standing beside me. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. For the first few seconds, I stood frozen in the familiar basement that had suddenly become foreign. The old ceiling bulb swayed slightly, its weak yellow light spilling over stacked cardboard boxes, old Christmas decorations, family photo albums, a few wooden chairs with broken legs that Howard had always refused to let me throw away. I had come down here countless times over more than 30 years of living in this lakeside house, but never had it felt so small and suffocating. "Howard, I don't understand," I whispered, my hand gripping his arm like a survival reflex. "They locked the door." I rushed to the stairs and yanked hard on the doorknob. It didn't budge. I pounded my hands against the wooden door, the sound echoing back hollow and frighteningly weak. "Daniel, what are you doing?" "Open this door right now." My voice broke apart, no longer holding the calm of a mother used to protecting, used to enduring. From upstairs, I heard footsteps moving away. Then Claire's voice drifted down again, still even, still carrying that fake sweetness I had grown used to hearing over the past 5 years. "Please stay calm. We just want everything to go smoothly. The doctor will be here soon." The doctor. The word rang in my head like an alarm bell. Not because I was afraid of hospitals or white coats, but because I understood all too well that in this world it only takes one doctor's signature for an elderly person's entire life to be sealed shut. I turned to look at Howard. He wasn't running to the door. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't pounding on anything. He was simply standing there, back straight, eyes strangely clear, completely unlike the 72-year-old man my son had just described as starting to decline. "Howard," I swallowed hard, "what are they planning to do to us?" He placed both hands on my shoulders and gave a gentle squeeze, just enough to make me feel that he was here, truly here. "Margaret," he said softly, "do you remember how I once told you that some things are safer the less you know?" I frowned. Decades of marriage flashed through my mind, quiet dinners, short vacations, weekend mornings on the porch watching the lake shimmer. Howard had never been a mysterious man. He was a construction engineer, principled, orderly, someone who hated complications. He wasn't the type to keep secrets. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice dropping. Instead of answering, he tilted his head, signaling me to be quiet. We stood completely still for a few seconds, listening. Upstairs, I heard Daniel speaking in a low, urgent voice, followed by footsteps pacing back and forth. Maybe they were waiting, or calling someone. Howard gently pulled me back, away from the stairs, toward the old brick wall at the far end of the basement. A chill ran through me. I had been looking at that wall for decades, dark bricks, some chipped, others stained with damp patches from the lake's moisture. "Do you remember," Howard whispered, "when you asked me why I never let anyone repair this section of the wall?" My heart started racing. I remembered. I had complained that it looked ugly, that it ruined the house I loved showing off to friends every summer. Howard had just smiled and said, "It's fine the way it is." "You said it was convenient," I stammered. He nodded. "That's right. Convenient. A small noise came from upstairs, maybe the front door opening. I heard Claire say faintly, "Yes, we're waiting." I began to understand, not through logic, but through the instinct of a mother, of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize when something was no longer about family. This morning, everything had started to go wrong the moment Daniel walked in with a smile that was far too practiced. My son was not a man who smiled easily. I had raised him for 43 years. I knew him well. Daniel smiled freely only when he was a child, when his father taught him how to fish, when I baked apple pie for Thanksgiving. Since marrying Claire, his smiles had become conditional. "Mom, Dad," Claire had said in a voice light as a feather, "we think it's time to have a serious conversation about your future." Future, a word that sounds beautiful, but for older people it is often used as the opening line for decisions they are not allowed to refuse. That was why, when the basement door locked, I no longer thought this was a misunderstanding. I understood perfectly. This was a plan, and it had been prepared for a long time. I looked back at Howard. Under the dim yellow light, his face looked older than usual, but his eyes did not. They were sharp and alert, like when he was still working, whenever he spotted an error in a blueprint. "Howard," I lowered my voice, almost pleading, "if you know what's going on, you have to tell me." He was silent for a few seconds. I could feel the struggle inside him, between the habit of protecting me with silence and the reality that this time, silence could kill both of us. "I never meant for you to find out this way," he said slowly, "but maybe now is the time." He took another step toward the old brick wall. I followed, my heart pounding so loudly I was afraid it could be heard. His hand lifted, brushing lightly across the bricks, stopping at one darker than the rest. In that exact moment, I understood why he had been so calm when his own son locked us in the basement, and I knew that the life I thought had finally settled at 69 had just officially turned in a completely different direction. Howard was still standing in front of the brick wall, his hand resting lightly on that darker brick, but he didn't do anything yet. He looked at me, his eyes signaling me to wait, and in that moment, the memory of this morning flooded back, so vivid, I could almost smell the coffee steaming in the kitchen again, hear the lake birds outside, and feel that vague unease I had tried to brush aside. The morning had begun far too perfectly. Daniel and Claire arrived earlier than usual. Too early. My son rarely stopped by before 10, always blaming traffic or meetings. Yet today, just after 8, I heard a car pull into the driveway. When I opened the door, Claire stood there with an overly wide smile, almost deliberate, holding a box of pastries from my favorite bakery in town. "Mom, I know you like blueberry," she said, her voice sweet as honey. Daniel stood behind her, hands in his jacket pockets, nodding as he explained, "We just thought, it's been a long time since we had a serious family talk." That single sentence sent a chill down my spine. Serious talks in families rarely bring good news, especially when they come with pastries and forced smiles. We sat around the kitchen table. Morning sunlight streamed through the large window overlooking the lake, reflecting off the calm water. I remember thinking, how strange, on such a beautiful morning to feel so heavy inside. Claire began. She was always good at this. "Lately you've been looking more tired," she said, placing her hand on mine, a gesture I once thought was caring, but now, looking back, felt controlling. "You're always worrying about Dad, about the house, about everything. I think you deserve to rest." I was about to brush it off with a laugh, but before I could speak, Daniel continued, his voice slow and careful, like he was reading from a rehearsed script. "And Dad, he's been forgetting things lately. he said. Last week, he even forgot a doctor's appointment. Howard looked up from his newspaper. I didn't forget. I rescheduled. Daniel avoided his father's eyes. Claire immediately cut in. But the doctor said it already. Little signs like that, we shouldn't ignore them. I set my coffee cup down on the table. The soft clink sounded louder than usual. Which doctor? I asked. Claire smiled. Dr. Cole, the one I introduced last time. I remembered that visit very clearly. A completely routine checkup, where Howard answered every question clearly, even joking that he remembered his doctor's schedule better than his own birthday. Claire leaned closer to me, lowering her voice into something intimate and concerned. Mom, we're just worried. People say at this stage many older folks don't realize they're getting weaker. I realized I was being placed into an invisible box, one labeled elderly and lacking self-awareness. Then Claire mentioned a name I had never heard before, Silver Haven Residence. It's a wonderful place, she said, her eyes lighting up, a high-end senior living facility like a resort, private rooms, doctors on duty, 24 hours, an indoor pool, a book club. You'd love it. We already went to see it, Daniel added, unable to hide his enthusiasm this time. The scenery is beautiful. Security is great. You and Dad wouldn't have to worry about anything. I remember asking, very slowly, very carefully, how much does it cost? Claire hesitated for just a breath, then answered as if it were nothing. About $8,500 a month for both of you. I did the math quickly in my head. $8,500 a month, more than $100,000 a year. I looked at Daniel, then at Claire. My son worked in sales, his income unstable. Claire worked at a bank, earning a decent salary, but not enough to casually cover a number like that. And who's paying? I asked. The air in the kitchen suddenly grew heavy. Claire looked at Daniel. Daniel sighed as if I were the one being difficult. You have this house, he said, his tone softer but no longer respectful. It's too big for just the two of you anyway. Selling it would be enough to take care of the future. The lakeside house. The house Howard and I bought with a 30-year mortgage. The house where Daniel grew up, where he learned to swim off the wooden dock in the backyard, where I once sat sewing his high school graduation gown. And now it was being spoken of as a number in a calculation. So, I said slowly, you want to sell your parents' house, put us in a nursing home, and then, what about the rest? Claire rushed to answer. You're misunderstanding. Everything is for you. The remaining money will be managed carefully. You won't have to worry about anything. I looked at Howard. He folded his newspaper and sat up straight. No, he said. Just one word. Clear, final. Dad, Daniel began. I said no, Howard repeated. We're not selling the house, and we're not going anywhere. I had never seen Claire's expression change so fast. The smile on her lips froze, then vanished, revealing something colder and harder underneath. Howard, she said, calling him by his name for the first time without Dad. The doctor has already been clear. You're not in the best condition to make decisions anymore. I felt the blood rush to my face. What are you talking about? Claire turned to me, her eyes carrying a carefully polished look of pity. Mom, you're always protecting Dad, but have you thought that you might be exhausted too? The words were like a velvet-wrapped knife. They didn't draw blood right away, but they cut deep. Daniel stood up, pulling his chair back with a harsh scrape against the floor. You should think carefully. We've already prepared the paperwork. What paperwork? I asked. Claire opened her purse and pulled out a thick folder. I glanced at it and saw familiar but terrifying words. Property transfer, legal power of attorney, capacity evaluation. Howard stood up. He didn't raise his voice, but it hardened. "I'm not signing anything." A heavy silence fell over the kitchen. Then Daniel said the sentence that, even now, standing in this cold basement, I still hear word for word. "You're no longer clear-headed enough to make your own decisions." From that moment on, everything was decided. Now, standing in this cold basement, I understood that this morning had never been a family discussion. It was the first trial, and the verdict had already been written. They were just waiting for us to sign. Howard turned to look at me. His eyes were no longer those of the gentle older husband I was used to, but of a man who had been preparing for this for a very long time. "You see," he said quietly, "this wasn't sudden." I nodded, my throat dry. Above us, I heard footsteps returning, faster this time. Howard took a deep breath. Then he turned fully toward the old brick wall, and I knew that what I had once believed was my peaceful past had just been violently torn open. Howard had just turned fully toward the brick wall when, above our heads, I heard a phone ring. It wasn't Daniel's familiar ringtone, but Claire's, sharp and short. The sound echoed down into the basement through the stairwell gap, cold and clear, so sharp it felt like someone had knocked directly against my temple. "Yes, doctor." Claire's voice came through, smooth and terrifyingly calm. "I think their condition has worsened." I froze. Howard stopped. He didn't turn around, but I saw his shoulders tense slightly, a tiny, lightning-fast reaction, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. "I know," Claire continued, lowering her voice, though every word still reached my ears. "The delusions are more obvious now. They believe we're conspiring against them. Yes, especially her. Me." I clapped a hand over my mouth instinctively, as if afraid that even breathing too loudly would be taken as proof of so-called delusions. My heart began to race, pounding so hard I felt dizzy. "Yes, Dr. Raymond Cole," Claire went on, sounding as though she were reading from a report. "We followed all the instructions. No, they're not cooperative. The husband is still very stubborn. Yes, I think a direct evaluation is necessary." There was a brief silence. I imagined a man on the other end nodding, taking notes, confirming a script that had already been written. "We brought them down to the basement so they could calm down," Claire said, and this time she didn't even lower her voice. "Just temporary isolation. Isolation." The word echoed in my head, heavy and cold. Not a bedroom. Not the living room, the basement. I turned to look at the stairs. The wooden door above was still firmly shut. I didn't hear Daniel anymore. Only Claire's voice, and my son's silence was more frightening than anything she could have said. "The doctor will arrive within 45 minutes, Claire concluded. "Thank you, doctor." The call ended with a dry, hollow beep. In that moment, I had no doubts left. This wasn't a family argument that had gotten out of hand. This was a procedure, a process, and we, Howard and I, were simply its subjects. I stepped backward until my back hit an old wooden shelf. My knees weakened. I had to grab the shelf to keep from collapsing. "They're going to declare us incompetent," I whispered, my voice trembling so badly it startled even me. "Howard, they're really going to do it." He turned to look at me. His eyes weren't panicked. On the contrary, they were so calm it scared me. "I know," he said. Just 2 words, but they struck my chest like a blow. "You know?" I shook my head. "Since when?" "Howard, they just called a doctor. They're building a story, and that doctor is coming to confirm it." "Since Claire started asking me about my memory," he replied evenly. "Since Daniel asked if I still remembered my bank card PIN. Since they started talking more about responsibility and safety than about family." I closed my eyes. Fragmented memories snapped together into a picture that was painfully clear. Questions that had seemed harmless. Concern that sounded like care, but was really inspection. "Daniel?" I whispered my son's name, as if saying it might somehow turn everything back to the way it was. "How could you let this happen?" I looked up at the stairs, as if I could see through the wooden door and into his face. In my mind, I saw Daniel as a little boy, brown-haired, scraped knees, running toward me after every fall from his bicycle. The child who once sobbed uncontrollably just at the thought that his parents might be angry with him. Now that same child was standing upstairs, silently letting his wife call a doctor to declare his mother delusional. "Daniel couldn't avoid this," Howard said softly, as if reading my thoughts. "He's already made his choice." I spun around. "No, he's just being manipulated by Claire. You know Daniel. He's not that cruel." Howard didn't argue. He only looked at me, his eyes filled with both compassion and resolve. "Have you noticed," he said, "that he hasn't looked you in the eye once since this morning?" The words stopped me cold. I replayed it in my mind, in the kitchen, when I asked about the money, when I asked about the paperwork. Daniel had always looked down at the table or over at Claire. Not once had he met my eyes. My heart twisted. Above us, I heard footsteps. Then Daniel's voice came down the stairs, for the first time since the door had been locked. "Mom!" he called, his voice no longer shaking, but no longer warm either. "Just stay calm. This is for your own good." I rushed toward the stairs and grabbed the wooden railing. "What are you doing, Daniel?" I screamed. "Do you realize that locking your parents up like this is illegal?" There was no immediate answer. I heard Claire whisper something to him, too quietly for me to hear, but long enough for me to understand that my opinion no longer mattered. "The doctor is just coming to evaluate," Daniel said afterward. "If everything's fine, you'll be allowed back to your room." Back to your room. Not opening the door, not apologizing, not letting us out, but allowed back to your room. A wave of panic surged through me, fast and violent. My heart pounded so hard I had to press a hand to my chest. The air in the basement felt thick, hard to breathe. "Howard," I gasped, "I can't breathe." He stepped to me immediately, placing a hand on my back, rubbing it in slow, steady circles. "Look at me," he said, his voice low but firm. "Breathe in. Now breathe out. Slowly." I did as he said, though tears were already spilling over. In my mind, the worst possibilities lined up one after another. I had heard too many stories. With just one word, incompetent, I could lose the right to make decisions about my property, my home, even my own medical care. They could take me anywhere, keep me there, and call it care. "Howard," I whispered, tears running down my chin, "if that doctor signs the papers, what do we do?" He looked straight into my eyes. "That's why I've been staying calm." The words sent a chill through me. Not fear, realization. The man standing in front of me was no longer the gentle, older husband I had known in daily life. "They think this basement is isolation," he continued, his voice low and clear. "But to me, it's something else." "What?" I asked, barely breathing. Howard turned his head, scanning the basement. Every corner, every shadow, every old brick. He didn't answer right away. "Margaret," he said finally, "do you trust me?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Then listen to me," he said. "No matter what you hear upstairs, no matter what they say, don't react on instinct. Don't argue. Don't try to prove you're lucid. Let them believe they're in control." I swallowed hard. "Why?" He stepped toward the brick wall again. His hand rested once more on that darker brick, this time firmly. "Because," he said, "in this kind of game, the person who thinks they've already won is usually the one who loses the fastest." Above us, I heard a car pull up outside, doors closing, new footsteps, heavier, slower. The doctor had arrived. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the entire basement could hear it. I looked at Howard, then at the old brick wall, and for the first time since the basement door had slammed shut behind me, I understood that my greatest fear was no longer being declared incompetent. It was about to learn the truth my husband had been hiding for nearly half a lifetime. The footsteps above grew closer, but Howard didn't turn around. He stood close to the old brick wall, his hand placed exactly on that darker brick I had seen for decades without ever noticing. Under the basement's weak yellow light, it looked no different from the others, old, rough, anonymous. If not for this moment, I would never have believed that something so ordinary could change an entire life. Howard took a deep breath. I watched his chest rise and fall, slow and controlled. He pressed his thumb lightly against the brick. At first, nothing happened. My heart pounded. I even thought I had imagined it, that this was just a hopeless attempt to calm me in the middle of panic. Then suddenly, a very small click sounded. Not loud, not dramatic, but in the enclosed space of the basement, it was so clear that goosebumps rose on my skin. Howard pushed the brick inward, not forcefully, not prying, but with a familiar motion, as if he had done this many times before. A thin seam appeared between the surrounding bricks. Then an entire section of the wall shifted slightly to the side, revealing a narrow black gap. My mouth fell open, but no words came out. Howard slid his hand into the opening and pulled gently. The whole section of wall moved aside like a hidden door. Behind it was not concrete or dirt, as I had always assumed, but a completely different space. Darker, deeper, and terrifyingly organized. "My God," I whispered, my voice breaking. Howard reached inside and flipped a small switch. White light flooded on. Not the old basement bulb, but sharp modern lighting, the kind I'd only ever seen in offices or professional workspaces. I stood frozen. Inside was a sealed room, not large but obsessively neat. Metal shelves lined both walls, stacked with carefully labeled file boxes. A work desk sat in the center, holding a fairly new desktop computer, a small printer, and a thick bundle of documents tied neatly together. In the corner, a dark gray safe rested against the wall, heavy and solid. I stepped forward once, then stopped, as if afraid that one more movement might make everything collapse. "Howard," I turned to him, my throat dry. "What is this?" He closed the hidden door behind us. When the wall slid back into place, the outer basement seemed to disappear entirely, leaving us in a separate space, so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. "I meant to tell you," he said, his voice low and steady. "But not now. Not like this." I let out a shaky, breathless laugh. "Are you kidding me? Howard, I've lived in this house for 30 years. I've cleaned every corner, every stair. I thought I knew every brick in it." He looked at me, a flicker of regret crossing his eyes. "I know." I slowly turned in a circle, my hand brushing over the file shelves, touching labels with years, locations, names. They weren't family papers, not bills or renovation contracts. They looked like evidence. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked. "Almost 24 years, he replied. 24 years. The number hit me like a slap. 24 years. Nearly as long as we'd owned this house. All that time, I said slowly, I knew nothing. Howard sat down in the chair by the desk. Suddenly, he looked visibly older. His shoulders sagged, his back curved slightly, as if the weight he'd carried for so long had finally been set down. "I wanted you to be safe," he said. "I wanted you to live a normal life." I swallowed. "And you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened a drawer, pulled out a thick folder, and placed it on the desk. On its cover was a year that made my blood run cold, 2001. "I didn't retire," Howard said, no longer evasive. "I disappeared." I looked at him, then at the folder. A memory surfaced. The day he came home earlier than usual, more than 20 years ago. I remembered asking him about it and him saying the company was restructuring, that he'd decided to step away. "I was the lead supervising engineer," he continued, "for a major project in the northern suburbs of the city, a 12-story commercial building. I heard the name of that city, heard that location, and a cold sensation ran straight down my spine. I had seen it on the news before, a long time ago. It collapsed one morning," Howard said, his voice steady, "during rush hour. 52 people died." I raised a hand to cover my mouth. Old blurry images in my memory suddenly became brutally sharp. Piles of concrete, ambulances, blankets covering motionless bodies. You? You were involved?" I asked, my voice barely sounding like my own. "I warned them," he said, 3 times. "I wrote reports. I demanded construction be halted because the materials didn't meet standards." He opened the folder, flipped through a few pages quickly, then turned it toward me. I saw copies of emails, technical notes, Howard's signature at the bottom of the pages. "They ignored it," he went on, "because replacing the materials would have cost an extra $2 million. And when the building collapsed..." He stopped and took a deep breath. "They needed someone to take responsibility." I understood before he finished. "You." Howard nodded. "They forged my signature, said I had approved everything. The media needed a name, the authorities needed a culprit, and I was the perfect choice." I staggered back a step, gripping the table to stay upright. I looked at the man in front of me, the husband who had slept beside me for 46 years, and realized I had never known this part of his life. "They threatened me," Howard said, his voice lowering. "Not just me, you, and Daniel, who was just a boy back then." My heart tightened. "Threatened how?" "Accidents," he said simply. "Things that look like accidents." A heavy silence settled over the hidden room. I could hear cars passing somewhere far away, as if from another world. "So you stayed silent," I whispered. Howard nodded. "I walked away from everything. I came home. I became an ordinary husband, an ordinary father, and I began documenting." He gestured around the room. "Everything here is what I couldn't say out loud. Evidence, names, money trails, other deaths." I was trembling. "You lived with this alone for 24 years. Not completely alone," he said. "I had you, but I couldn't pull you into it." I looked at the safe in the corner, the computer still glowing, then back at Howard. Tears had started spilling without me noticing. "You thought I was that fragile?" I asked, not accusing, just aching. Howard stood and stepped in front of me. He placed his hand against my cheek as gently as the first day we met. "No," he said. "I thought you were too strong." Above us, I heard the basement door open. Claire's voice rang down, cold and controlled. "The doctor is here. Are you ready?" Howard looked at me one last time, his eyes firmer than ever. "Margaret," he said, "from this moment on, nothing will be the same." I nodded, tears running down my cheeks, because I knew that the secret buried for 24 years had just been unearthed. Claire's voice still echoed in my ears, but inside the hidden room behind the false wall, time seemed to slow. Howard stood at the desk, one hand resting on the thick folder, while I sat down on the metal chair beside it, my mind spinning under the weight of the truth that had just crashed down on me. "How long have you been watching them?" I asked, my voice hoarse from crying. Howard didn't answer right away. He opened the left drawer and took out an old notebook, its cover worn, the edges of the pages yellowed. He placed it in front of me and said slowly, 23 years. I opened the first page. The dates were written carefully, Howard's handwriting painfully familiar. The first page held a single line, Black Ridge Development. Surveillance begins. Black Ridge Development. The name wasn't unfamiliar. I had seen it on billboards along the highway, on newly built office towers. In business articles Howard used to skim in the mornings. A large, successful corporation, praised as a symbol of modern urban development. Their chairman is Victor Harlan, Howard said, as if mentioning an old acquaintance, one of the most powerful men in this state. I looked up at him. You know him? Howard gave a thin smile. Not socially, but I know him very well. He pulled a file box from the shelf and opened it. Inside were copies of contracts, expense statements, printed emails, everything organized by year, by project, by name. After the collapse in 2001, Howard said, I started there, not for revenge, but to understand. Understand what? I asked. Why a building could collapse like that, he replied, and why the people truly responsible kept building, kept being celebrated. I skimmed a few pages. The numbers staring back at me were no longer familiar household expenses, but sums so large they made me dizzy. Howard pointed to a ledger. This, he said, bribes, disguised as consulting fees. He flipped to another page. This is money laundering. Subsidiaries, shell companies, routed through 3 states, then back again. Each page he turned felt like another blade cutting deeper into my understanding of the world I thought I lived in. I had believed these things existed only in newspapers and on television. I never imagined they were hidden right beneath my feet, behind an old brick wall. They signed contracts for cheaper materials, Howard continued, his voice even, like someone who had told this story too many times in his own head. They falsified inspection reports, and if anyone noticed, he stopped, his eyes darkening. Then that person went silent. How? I asked. Though I already suspected the answer. Howard pulled 3 photographs from another file and laid them on the desk in front of me. 3 men, 3 different faces, but they shared something in common. Serious, intelligent eyes. 3 engineers, he said. They worked for Black Ridge. They asked questions. I picked up one photo. Accidents, Howard said. One fell from scaffolding. One died in a gas line explosion at home. One was hit by a car while jogging. I shuddered. And no one questioned it? Some did, he replied. But suspicion isn't enough. Not when you're up against money, politics, and connections you can't see. I set the photos down, my hands shaking. You lived with all of this, and still came home, had dinner with me, took our son to school. Howard nodded slightly. I had to, so no one would suspect anything, so you and Daniel would be safe. And you? I asked. He smiled sadly. I wasn't on the priority list. I turned away, not wanting him to see my tears, but in that small room there was nowhere to hide. You keep everything here? I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady. Not just here, Howard said. This is only part of it. He turned on the computer. The screen lit up, showing an interface I had never seen on his home computer. Encrypted folders, files labeled with initials, dates, codes. Everything has backups, he explained, in multiple locations, multiple formats. I looked at him, feeling both proud and terrified. If something happens to you? Howard nodded as if he'd been waiting for that question. Then everything is released automatically. Released? I repeated. Sent to the press, sent to investigators, sent to people they can't silence all at once. My scalp went numb. You prepared for your own death. Howard shook his head. I prepared for the truth. A soft sound came from above, like a door closing. I held my breath. Howard glanced at his watch. "They think they're controlling the situation," he said quietly, "but locking us down here triggered the emergency protocol." "What protocol?" I asked. He turned to me, more serious than I had ever seen him. "Emergency protocol." He typed quickly on the keyboard. A small window appeared on the screen, a countdown ticking away. "This is a safeguard," he said. "If I don't confirm my safety status within a certain time, the system starts sending the data." My heart pounded. "Howard, you planned for this." "From the day I realized they would eventually come for me," he replied, "and possibly through my own family." I lowered my head, guilt flooding in. If I had known sooner. He placed his hand over mine. "You couldn't have changed this, and I didn't want you living in fear all those years." I took a deep breath. "So what now?" Howard looked at the screen, then at me. "Now I take the next step." He opened another drawer and pulled out a phone I had never seen before. Small, black, no logo. "This phone isn't tied to any personal account," he said. "It can't be traced the usual way." I realized I was shaking. "Who are you calling?" Howard looked at me for a long moment, as if making sure I was ready to hear the answer. "The FBI," he said. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. In my mind, the peaceful life I thought I had shattered into pieces. "You've been working with them all this time?" I finally managed. "Not officially," Howard replied. "Not until now." He glanced back at the countdown on the screen, the numbers slowly decreasing. "But now," he said, "it's time." Above us, I heard shoes pacing, Daniel and Claire's voices drifting down, indistinct. They had no idea that, right beneath their feet, a chain of events had been set in motion. One Howard had prepared for 23 years. Howard raised the phone to his ear. Before dialing, he looked at me. "Margaret," he said, his voice low and firm. "From this moment on, there's no turning back." I nodded, my heart racing. "We lost the chance to turn back the moment they locked the basement door," I replied. Howard gave a faint smile, then dialed. And in that instant, I knew that everything we had once called peace had only been the silence before the storm. Howard set the phone down on the desk. The computer screen in front of us was still glowing. I expected him to say something to reassure me, or at least explain the next step. Instead, he quietly opened another folder. A name appeared on the screen that made my heart tighten. Daniel L. I jumped to my feet, the metal chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor. "Howard, what are you doing?" I asked, though part of me already knew. He turned to me, his eyes filled with exhaustion and resolve. "Margaret, I tried to avoid this for as long as I could, but you need to know." He clicked the mouse. A flood of documents appeared. Bank statements, emails, security camera stills, all bearing my son's name. My throat went dry. "No, Daniel wouldn't." Howard raised a hand, signaling me to sit. "Look." I looked, and line by line, number by number, it felt like hammer blows crashing into my chest. $372,000. The figure was highlighted in red on a summary sheet. Gambling debt, accumulated in less than 2 years. "Casinos in Atlantic City," Howard said slowly, "and several underground gambling rooms." I shook my head, feeling like I was reading the file of a stranger. "Daniel doesn't gamble. He's always hated that stuff." Howard didn't argue. He simply turned to another page. Photos of Daniel leaving a casino, a baseball cap pulled low. Another image showed him sitting in a VIP room, stacks of multicolored chips in front of him. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "Why do you have all of this?" "Because I had to know," Howard said, "and because someone wanted me to know." He opened another email. The sender was an unfamiliar address. The recipient, Daniel. "We need someone inside the family, someone with access to the assets. You're a good fit." I let out a hollow laugh. "Family? Is that what they're calling us?" Howard didn't laugh. "They're talking about you and me." I looked at him, then back at the screen. "What about Claire?" I asked, my voice shaking. Howard typed a few keys. Another folder opened, labeled Claire B. "Claire has worked at a bank since she was very young," he said. "At first, just an administrative position. But then transfer records appeared. Small transactions, scattered, hard to detect. But when assembled, they formed a clear money trail. Funds moving in, funds moving out, routed through multiple accounts and shell companies. She helped move the money," Howard said. "Not directly, but enough to stay under the radar. Daniel owed money. Blackridge offered a solution." My stomach twisted. "What solution?" "Money laundering," he replied, "and in return, they wiped out his debt." I stood up and took a few steps around the cramped room, clutching my chest. "No, Daniel couldn't." "Daniel did," Howard said, without anger, without judgment, just the bare truth. "He signed the papers, took the money, and followed instructions." I turned back to him. "Then what about Silver Haven?" Howard opened another folder. This time it contained images of a beautiful, bright building. Green grounds, a small pond, a silver-plated sign, Silver Haven Senior Living. "A luxury care facility," I murmured. "Claire said it was the best." Howard nodded. "On paper." He pulled out a chart, timelines marked in red. "People who go in here," he said, "live an average of no more than 11 months. My eyes widened. "What?" "Heart failure," he continued. "Strokes, kidney failure, natural causes." I trembled. "But they're elderly. That happens." Howard shook his head. "Not at this rate." He opened another statistical table. Cold, emotionless numbers. A comparison between Silver Haven and other facilities in the same region. 3 times higher, he said. And all of these people had one thing in common. "What?" I whispered. "Significant assets," Howard replied. "Homes, retirement funds, real estate." My head felt like it was about to explode. "You're saying?" "Silver Haven is a legal place to end the lives of wealthy seniors," he said, "with paperwork, with signatures, with decisions made in their best interest." I collapsed back into the chair, no longer able to stand. "And Daniel?" Howard looked at me, sadness deeper than ever in his eyes. "Daniel needed money, and they needed control of our assets." "So that's why they said we were incompetent," I whispered, the pieces finally fitting together. "That's why they wanted legal power of attorney," Howard nodded. "Once we enter Silver Haven, the assets transfer legally. No disputes, no investigations." I broke down, tears pouring uncontrollably. "He's my son." Howard came to me and placed a hand on my shoulder. "I know." I looked up at him. "When did you know?" "A year ago," he answered, when Daniel started asking questions he'd never asked before. I remembered. Recent dinners, Daniel asking about the will, about insurance, about the value of the lake house. I had laughed, thinking it was just the idle concern of an adult child. "I meant to tell you," Howard continued, "but I hoped Daniel would stop." I wiped my tears, my voice breaking. "But he didn't." Howard shook his head. "No." And as the gambling debt grew, as Blackridge tightened the pressure, he chose the easiest path. I clenched my hands. "Killing us. With paperwork." Howard said nothing. The silence answered for him. Above us, footsteps sounded. I heard Daniel's voice drifting down, indistinct but enough to make my heart ache. "Margaret," Howard said softly, "I need you to understand one thing." I turned to him. "We're not just protecting ourselves," he said. We're standing against a system that has killed a lot of people, legally. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to hold, and our son is part of that system. Howard nodded slowly. I closed my eyes for a moment. When I opened them, I knew I was no longer the woman I had been a few hours earlier. My last innocence had been stripped away, not by a distant enemy, but by my own blood. "If this is a war," I said, my voice low but steady, "then I want to know where I stand." Howard looked at me, and for the first time in that room, he smiled. Not a smile of relief, but the smile of a man who was finally no longer fighting alone. "You stand with me," he said, and in that moment, between concrete walls and buried secrets, I understood that the most painful thing wasn't betrayal itself, but realizing you must face that truth in order to survive. Howard didn't hesitate another second. He pulled a small black phone from the bottom drawer of the desk, its surface matte, no logo, no touchscreen, like any phone I had ever known. It looked like a device from another world, a world I had just been dragged into without time to adjust. "Satellite phone," Howard said, as if reading my thoughts. "It doesn't rely on local towers. It can't be cut off." I watched him dial a short sequence of numbers, fast, decisive. My heart was pounding so loudly I feared the people upstairs might hear it. The call connected almost immediately. "Lewis?" A woman's voice answered, calm and firm. "Confirm identity." Howard responded with a string of characters I didn't understand. The woman fell silent for 2 seconds, then her tone changed. No longer verification, but confirmation. "Confirmed. Are you safe?" Howard glanced at me. "Not yet," he said, "but we're alive." I heard the sound of typing on the other end. Then her voice came back clearer, more serious. "Our team is en route. Estimated time to reach you, 45 minutes. 45 minutes. Under normal circumstances, that would be just the time it takes for a cup of coffee to go cold. Right now, it felt as long as an entire lifetime. "Silver Haven," Howard continued, "and Dr. Raymond Cole." "We know," the woman replied. "Both have been under surveillance for over 2 years." I held my breath. Howard didn't look surprised, but for me, it was another blow to my understanding. "Daniel and Claire," Howard said slowly. "They locked us in the basement." There was a very brief pause. Then her voice turned icy. "In that case," she said, "they are approaching the threshold of committing federal kidnapping." I closed my eyes. My son. The word kidnapping sounded too distant, too brutal to be attached to the name Daniel, the boy who once sobbed when he broke his arm at 8, who used to call me every night his first week of college because he couldn't sleep. "We need you to remain where you are," the woman continued. "Do not confront them. Do not reveal yourselves." Howard nodded instinctively, even though she couldn't see him. "Understood." The call ended. Howard set the phone down, his hands still steady. I had to grip the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing. "You said federal witness protection?" I asked, my voice so low I could barely hear it myself. Howard exhaled slowly, as if finally allowing himself to relax just a little. 5 years, he said. 5 official years. I turned to him, unable to hide my shock. 5 years, and I never knew. "Because you weren't allowed to," he replied, "and because I didn't want you to." I gave a soft, humorless laugh. You protected the whole world, but thought I couldn't handle the truth. Howard looked at me, his gaze gentle. "I thought that if you didn't know, you could live like a normal person a little longer." I was about to respond when a noise above startled me. A door slammed open, rushed footsteps. No more stealth. "Howard," I whispered, "something's wrong." Howard moved quickly to the computer and activated the camera system. The screen split into multiple small windows, each showing a corner of the house I thought I knew down to every creak. The living room, the front door wide open. Daniel stood there. But he wasn't alone. Beside my son were two unfamiliar men. Both wore dark jackets, solid builds, eyes so cold I shivered just looking at them on the screen. "Where's Claire?" I asked, my heart racing. Howard zoomed in on another camera. The back exit. Claire's car was gone. "She left," Howard said, his voice darkening. "She ran." My lungs felt like they'd been emptied. "She left Daniel behind?" "No," Howard replied. "She played her role, sent others." I looked back at the screen. Daniel was speaking to the two men. His face was tense, but not panicked. Not the look of someone being forced. "Our son," I whispered. "Does he know who they are?" Howard was silent for a few seconds. Then he said, "Yes." One of the men walked to the basement door. I saw his hand rest on the handle, testing it lightly. The door didn't open. He turned to Daniel and said something. Daniel nodded. My heart slammed painfully against my ribs. "Howard, what are they going to do?" Howard didn't answer right away. He stared at the screen, like someone rereading a script he had predicted but still hoped wouldn't come true. "They want what's down here," he said finally. "The evidence, and if necessary, to eliminate the witnesses." I clenched my hands. "So our son is leading them," Howard said without flinching. A knock echoed from the basement door. Not polite, not asking. A knock meant to announce. "Dad, Mom." Daniel's voice came down through the thick concrete. "Open the door. This has gone too far." I stepped forward instinctively, the reflex of a mother, but Howard stopped me. "Margaret," he said softly. "Don't. I have to talk to him," I whispered. "He's still my son." Howard looked at me for a long moment, then he nodded. "1 minute. Just one." I moved closer to the door, my heart threatening to leap from my chest. "Daniel!" I called, forcing my voice to stay steady. "What are you doing?" There was a pause. Then Daniel answered, his voice deeper, harder. "You wouldn't understand, Mom. Everything is more complicated than you think. It can all stop," I said, tears spilling. "You just need to leave this house. Right now." I heard my son sigh. "I can't." "Because of the money?" I asked. "Or because of them?" Daniel didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "Because I've gone too far, Mom." I closed my eyes. In that moment, I understood that the person standing upstairs was no longer the little boy I once held in my arms. He was a man who had made a choice, and that choice was pushing all of us toward the edge. Howard pulled me away from the door. On the screen, one of the two men had begun scanning the walls, his gaze probing. "We don't have much time," Howard said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "They know there's something here." I looked at him, then back at the screen, where my son was standing among strangers inside the very house I had once believed was the safest place in the world. The danger was no longer a possibility. It had crossed the threshold. Howard didn't say another word. He simply took my hand and led me away from the desk area, deeper into the back of the hidden room. There, under the dim yellow light, I saw a low steel door almost blending into the concrete wall. "When did you do all this?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. "One night at a time," Howard answered shortly. "Over 2 years." He unlocked it. The door made a very soft sound and opened, revealing a narrow passage sloping downward, barely wide enough for one person to crawl through. Inside was pitch dark, the air cold and damp, smelling of earth mixed with metal. "A tunnel," I said, not sure whether I was asking or stating a fact. "It leads to the Miller family's house," Howard said. "3 houses south. They moved away last year." I stood frozen. "You even prepared an escape route?" Howard turned to look at me. His eyes weren't panicked, weren't dramatic. They held only the steadiness of a man who had prepared for this moment for a very long time. "Margaret," he said, "listen to me." He went back to the desk, opened a small compartment inside the safe, and took out a black hard drive, small enough to fit in the palm of my hand. "A complete copy," he said, placing it in my hand. "Everything." I gripped it, feeling as though I were holding our entire life, and perhaps the lives of many others. "No," I said immediately, shaking my head hard. "No way. If we go together." Howard looked at me for a long moment. "We can't." "What are you going to do?" I asked, my heart racing. He turned to a control panel mounted on the wall. On it was a red button covered by a clear plastic guard. "Destroy the evidence," he said. "The originals." I stepped back. "What did you say?" "If they get into this room," Howard said slowly, "they can take or alter the data. The external copies won't matter if they can prove the source was compromised." "But you said there was an automatic system." "It still needs time," he cut me off, his voice turning firm for the first time. "And we don't have time." The sounds upstairs grew louder, no longer cautious footsteps, but heavy shoes moving straight down the basement stairs. I heard metal scraping against the wall, low, urgent voices. "Howard," I said, tears spilling over, "you can't stay." He stepped in front of me, placed both hands on my shoulders, and looked straight into my eyes. "Margaret, you have to go." "What about you?" I asked, my voice breaking. He smiled very faintly. "I'll stay here, and I'll make sure they don't get what they want." I shook my head, desperate. "Daniel is our son." Howard closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them, his calm was almost unbearable. "And that's exactly why you have to go." The outer basement door burst open. Metal scraped hard against the steps. I spun around in shock. "No time," Howard said. He pushed the hard drive deeper into my hand. "Take this. Go. Now." I didn't know where I found the strength to keep talking. "If you stay, I know," he said, "but I also know what I'm doing." He pulled me into a tight embrace. The familiar scent of his clothes, the familiar rhythm of his heartbeat. Everything burned itself into my memory one last time. "Margaret," he whispered in my ear, "you live. That's what matters most." I had no strength left to argue. The footsteps were very close now. I heard Daniel's voice echoing down, tense and urgent. "I know you're down there, Dad," Daniel shouted. "Don't make this worse." Howard released me and gently pushed me toward the tunnel. "Go," he said. I bent down and crawled into the narrow passage. Cold earth scraped against my hands. I turned my head for one last look. Howard stood upright, his back to the tunnel, facing the room and whatever was about to come. "Howard," I called. He didn't turn around. He only raised his hand in a silent signal. I crawled into the darkness. The tunnel was so tight I had to breathe very slowly. My knees scraped against the dirt, burning with pain. Every movement made a soft rustling sound, and my heart pounded with fear of being discovered. Behind me, voices grew clearer. Strangers' voices, Daniel's voice. "There's something here," a man said. "My father hid it," Daniel replied, his voice tight. "I'm sure of it." I bit my lip to keep from crying out. Every word from my son felt like a knife twisting into my back. I kept crawling through the thick darkness. The tunnel was longer than I'd expected. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Then I heard another sound, far away, very faint, but unmistakable. Sirens. At first, just a single sound, very distant. I thought I was imagining it from the stress. But then it sounded again, and again, more of them, closer. Police sirens. My heart pounded so hard my ears rang. I crawled faster, my hands shaking, not daring to stop. Behind me, the noise suddenly turned chaotic. I heard shouting, running footsteps, metal slamming into walls. FBI sirens blared insistently, cutting through the earth like a signal from another world, the world I was crawling back toward. At the end of the tunnel, a dim light appeared. I crawled a few more steps and emerged through a roughly covered wooden panel into an empty garage. The sudden open space made me dizzy. I dropped to my knees, gasping for air, tears streaming down my face. Outside, the sirens were getting closer. I clutched the hard drive to my chest. In my mind, there was only one thought. Not about my own safety, but about the man who had stayed behind the wall, facing everything so that I could live. And for the first time in my life, I truly understood what a life and death choice was. A choice with no right or wrong, only a price to be paid. 3 months after that night, I walked into the federal courthouse with ice-cold hands, even though outside it was a beautiful morning with pale sunlight. The gray stone building, the tall steps, and the American flag waving gently in the wind made me feel as though I was entering a place not meant for women nearly 70 years old. But then I thought of Howard, of the look in his eyes that night, and I kept walking. The courtroom was large, the ceiling high, white lights shining down on long wooden benches. I sat in the witness section, my back straight, but my heart pounding so hard I had to place my hands on my thighs to keep them from shaking. In front of me were the judge, the jury, the attorneys with thick folders. Across the room at the defendant's table, I saw Daniel. My son looked thinner. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes avoiding mine. None of the confidence he used to have. In that brief moment, old memories flooded back. His first day of school, his graduation day, the day he brought Claire home, holding my hand and smiling so brightly. I took a deep breath to keep from being pulled under by the past. When I stood to take the oath, my voice filled the terrifyingly quiet room. I heard my own voice, clear and slow, as if someone else were speaking through me. The prosecutor began with basic questions: my name, my age, my relationship to the defendants. Then he looked at me, his expression serious but not cold. "Mrs. Lewis," he said, "please tell the court what happened the night you and your husband were locked in the basement." I closed my eyes for a brief second. When I opened them, I no longer saw the courtroom. I saw the basement door slam shut. I heard the dry click of the lock. I heard Claire's cold voice from above. And I heard Howard whispering in my ear. I told them everything, without embellishment, without avoiding anything. I told them about the morning Daniel and Claire came over with smiles that were far too rehearsed. About Silver Haven, a name that sounded like a dream retirement, but was actually a doorway to death. I spoke about the paperwork, the legal phrases used like scalpels, slowly cutting away our right to decide for ourselves while still appearing lawful. In the courtroom, I saw people lowering their heads to take notes. I saw an older woman in the gallery raise a hand to her mouth, tears silently falling. When I described the hidden room behind the false wall, the years Howard had spent secretly collecting evidence, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. I didn't hide the fact that I had known nothing. I didn't pretend to be stronger than I was. I said plainly that I had trusted my son, trusted the ordinary life I thought I had. Then came Silver Haven. The prosecutor displayed documents the FBI had collected. Charts, statistics, cold numbers filled the large screen behind me. Mortality rates, the average time from admission to death. asset transfers that took place shortly before. Did you know, he asked me, that Silver Haven has had more than 300 suspicious deaths over the past 5 years? I shook my head, my throat tightening. I only found out when it was already too late. A man stood up from the gallery. His hands were shaking, his voice breaking as he asked to speak. The judge allowed it. He introduced himself as the son of a woman who had lived at Silver Haven. "They told me my mother died of heart failure," he said, tears streaming down his face. "But she was healthy when she went in. Just 6 months later, she was gone." The air in the courtroom grew heavy. I realized I wasn't just telling my own story. I was standing among countless others, other lives, other pain buried beneath officially stamped documents. When it was Daniel's turn to be questioned, I didn't look at him. I was afraid that if I did, I wouldn't be strong enough to continue. His attorney spoke of financial pressure, of debts, of manipulation by Claire and Blackridge's people. I heard every word, each one like a small but deep cut. "Did you know," the prosecutor asked Daniel, "that locking your parents in the basement and attempting to declare them legally incompetent could have led to their deaths?" Daniel was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. Just one small nod, but enough to send murmurs through the courtroom. "Then why did you still do it?" came the next question. Daniel lifted his head. For the first time during the entire trial, he looked at me. His eyes were red, exhausted, with nothing left to hide. "Because I thought I had no other choice," he said. I closed my eyes, not because I couldn't bear the truth, but because I realized it had existed for a long time. I just hadn't wanted to face it. Claire was different. She cooperated. She provided names, addresses, methods of transferring money. She spoke smoothly, clearly, like someone who had prepared for this moment long ago. In exchange, her sentence was reduced. I wasn't surprised. Claire always knew how to survive. On the day of sentencing, I sat quietly in the front row. Daniel received a sentence the attorneys called severe but appropriate. I heard the numbers, the legal terms, but they all blurred together. In my mind, there was only the image of a child who once held my hand to cross the street, now standing before the judge. When the trial ended, I walked outside alone. The late afternoon sun warmed the courthouse plaza in a strange, gentle way. I stood there for a long time, breathing, feeling my heartbeat slowly return to normal. I had once believed that being a mother meant carrying every mistake of your child on your own shoulders, that if a child went astray, it must be because you hadn't done enough. But standing in that courtroom, hearing hundreds of stories, both similar and different, I understood something. A mother's love doesn't make her child good or bad. It only gives them a place to begin. The rest, Isha, is their own choice. I was in pain. There's no other word for it. But I no longer blamed myself. I stood up, I told the truth, and I did what so many people are afraid to do. I looked betrayal straight in the eye, called it by its name, and did not turn away. When I left the courthouse, I knew my life had entered a different chapter. Not a chapter of fear or silence, but a chapter of awakening. And even though the price I had to pay was the pain of being a mother, I accepted it, not as a punishment, but as a truth that had to be faced, so that I could continue living the rest of my life fully and without bowing my head. I thought that when I walked out of that courtroom, everything had finally come to a close, that the truth had been exposed, the villains had been named, and the rest of my life, though scarred, could finally be peaceful. I was wrong. 3 days after the sentencing, as I was sitting alone in the temporary apartment provided by the federal authorities, looking out the window at the last autumn leaves quietly falling onto the sidewalk, the doorbell rang. It wasn't the familiar sound of a neighbor stopping by. It was short, firm, intentional. I knew it wasn't friends coming to check on me, and deep down, I knew that this story was not over yet. 2 FBI agents stood outside the door. They didn't need to introduce themselves. I had grown too familiar with the badges on their jackets, with those eyes that were both polite and alert. "Mrs. Lewis," the woman said, her voice low and measured, "we need to talk to you. Again." I invited them in. The small room suddenly felt tighter, as if the air itself understood that what was about to be said would not be light. The man opened a black briefcase and placed on the table a folder thinner than the ones I had seen before, yet heavy enough to weigh on my heart at first glance. "Victor Harlan," he said, "not the mastermind." I didn't react right away. I just stared at the name that had been repeated throughout the investigation, the name the media had called the brain behind Black Ridge Development. He was only a link, the woman continued, someone in the middle, powerful enough to operate, but not powerful enough to control the entire system. I sat up straighter. Then who was controlling it? They exchanged a very brief look. Then the man said something that sent a chill down my spine. A federal judge. The room was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. I had stood before a judge. I had believed that bench represented the final symbol of justice. And now, that justice had been twisted from within. "He didn't run things directly," the agent continued. "He controlled them with signatures, with rulings, with decisions about which cases moved forward and which ones were shut down." I swallowed hard. "Silverhaven?" "Just one link," the woman confirmed. "A model. There are at least 12 similar facilities in 3 other states." I closed my eyes. The numbers from the courtroom came back to me. Hundreds of deaths. Hundreds of families who had lost loved ones without ever being asked. "Howard," I said softly, almost by reflex. "My husband, did he know?" The man shook his head. "Not in the way you're thinking." He flipped to another page. "We believe Howard was used." I opened my eyes, my heart pounding. "Used how?" "By his integrity," the agent said. "By his desire to bring the truth to light." They explained it to me, piece by piece, each one falling into place with painful, brutal clarity. While Howard believed he was building a case to take down Blackridge and Victor Harlan, someone deeper in the shadows had been quietly steering that effort, removing Harlan, playing the hero, and keeping the real system running in the dark. "Your husband was an engineer," the woman said slowly. "He thought in logic. He believed that if the biggest link fell, everything else would collapse. But it didn't," I whispered. "No," the man replied. "Harlan was expendable." I sat there in silence. In my mind, I saw Howard in that hidden room, his eyes steady, believing he was doing the right thing, believing that once the truth came out, it would correct everything on its own. "So, what do you need me to do?" I asked, even though I had already sensed the answer. The woman placed both hands on the table and leaned toward me. "We need you to continue testifying." I let out a soft laugh, not because it was funny. "I already testified." "Not enough," she said. "What you know, what you've lived through. It can open other doors." I shook my head. "I'm not an investigator. I'm just a woman who lost her husband, lost her son, and nearly lost her life." The man looked at me, his gaze not coercive. "That's exactly why your voice carries weight." I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the city kept moving as if nothing had happened. People going to work, shopping, laughing. No one knew that beneath that orderly surface was a network that had taken so many lives. "I don't know if I have the strength," I said, my voice tired. "Every time I tell it, I relive everything." "We understand," the woman said softly. and we won't force you." I turned back to them. "But if I don't, then those people," she said, "may never be named." In my mind, I saw the man who had stood up in the courtroom, the son who lost his mother at Silver Haven, the older women who had covered their mouths and cried as they listened to me speak. I thought of myself just a few months earlier, naive, believing that family and the law were enough to protect me. "You're saying the truth goes deeper," I said, "and that I've only seen the surface." The man nodded. "That's right." I closed my eyes. In that brief darkness, I heard Howard's voice, not from a specific memory, but from the essence of who he was, his steadiness, his belief that silence was never the answer. When I opened my eyes, I knew I couldn't turn away. "I need time," I said. "Of course," the woman replied, "but you should know. We don't have much." After they left, the room grew quiet again. I sat down, feeling the weight of everything I had just heard pressing on my chest. Victor Harlan was not the mastermind. Silver Haven was just one link. Howard, the man I loved for nearly half my life, had been used as a tool to clear the way for someone else. The truth was not only painful, it was more complex than anything I had ever imagined. I looked at my hands. The hands that had trembled while signing papers, that had clutched the hard drive in the dark tunnel, that had rested on the witness stand in court. I was no longer the woman I used to be. That evening, I took out a stack of blank paper. I began writing down names, faces, stories I had heard in the courtroom. Each line was a reminder that if I stopped, everything could sink back into silence. I was still afraid. I was still hesitant. But the memory of the victims, those who never had a chance to stand up, pushed me forward, and for the first time since everything began, I understood that I was not just a witness to a conspiracy. I had become part of the truth, a truth still waiting to be pulled into the light. It took me nearly a week to make my decision, not because I didn't understand the importance of speaking out, but because I understood the cost all too well. I had seen what happened to those who asked questions. I had lived with a man who carried the truth in silence for more than 2 decades, and I knew that once you stepped into the light, there was no way back. Then, one very early morning, while the city was still wrapped in a thin layer of fog, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The first sunlight of the day fell across the old wooden surface where Howard and I had sat facing each other hundreds of times. I placed my hand on that table, closed my eyes, and in that moment, I no longer hesitated. I called the FBI agent back. "I agree," I said. My voice was so calm that I surprised even myself. "I'll go public with the story." Everything moved very quickly after that. So quickly that it felt as if I were being swept along by a current that had been waiting for a long time. Journalists began reaching out. Interviews were scheduled. The same questions repeated over and over, drilling into details I had tried to forget just to survive. The first time I sat in front of a camera, I trembled. Not because I was afraid of judgment, but because I knew I was opening the door to so many painful memories. Not only mine, but others as well. "I'm not a hero," I said in that first interview. "I'm just a woman who almost lost her right to live, and I don't want that to happen to anyone else." The program aired that evening. I didn't dare watch it. I turned off the television and sat in the quiet living room, listening to the clock tick. But the next morning, my phone began ringing non-stop. The first calls were from strangers. A woman with a trembling voice introduced herself as the daughter of someone who had lived at Silver Haven. An older man called to say his wife had died just 8 months after entering a nursing facility, and he had never understood why all the property paperwork had been handled so quickly. They told their stories. I listened. Some cried, some were angry. Some stayed silent for a long time on the other end of the line, as if for the first time in their lives, they no longer felt alone. The media response was stronger than I had imagined. Not just one article or one program, but a wave of independent investigations. Journalists digging into old rulings. Decisions that once seemed harmless were suddenly examined under a different light. The name Silver Haven appeared everywhere. Then other names followed. Premium care facilities with unusually high death rates, hastily signed rulings, files closed without questions, and then the name the FBI had mentioned, the federal judge, began appearing in the headlines. At first, just suspicions, then evidence, accounts and relatives' names, financial ties that could not be explained. The day he was arrested, I was sitting in a small waiting room at a newsroom, preparing for another interview. A young assistant walked in, eyes wide, her voice unable to hide her shock. "They just arrested him," she said, "right in his office." I didn't cheer. I didn't feel victorious. I simply sat down, placed my hand on my chest, and felt a lightness, as if part of an invisible burden had finally been lifted. The network began to collapse in ways I had never thought possible. Not in a single day, not with one decisive blow, but piece by piece, link by link, pulled into the light and forced to face the truth. New investigations were opened. Old rulings were reviewed. Hundreds of families received answers they had waited years for, even though those answers could never bring their loved ones back. During those months, there were times I was exhausted. Nights when I lay staring at the ceiling, wondering whether I had done the right thing, whether reopening all that pain truly brought any good. Whenever that happened, I thought of Howard, not in a sentimental way, but in a very practical one. I thought of his patience, the way he documented every detail, not out of hatred, but because he believed the truth had to be protected. I thought of how he had always stood behind me throughout our marriage, quietly, without show, but unshakably steady. And I understood that in some way he was still standing behind me now. I was no longer just a witness. I began to be invited to hearings on elder rights. I spoke to community groups. I met older people living alone, people who had signed documents without fully understanding the consequences. "I'm not here to tell you what to do," I often said. "I'm here to say that you have the right to ask questions, the right to refuse, the right to live out your life without being treated as an asset that needs to be handled." Gradually, I realized I had become something I never imagined, an advocate. Not because I was stronger than anyone else, but because I had gone through my greatest fear and learned what it looked like. I knew how silence could kill, and I knew that a voice, even a trembling one, could still create change. My family is no longer what it once was. That is the truth, and I won't soften it. There are no more noisy dinners, no more weekend calls from my son. There are empty spaces nothing can fill. But I have no regrets, because if I had stayed silent, I would have spent the rest of my life with a question that had no answer. Could I have done something differently? Now, every time I stand in front of a room full of people, every time I see an older woman nod as she listens to me speak, I know I made the right choice. Not the easy path, but the necessary one. And in the quietest moments, when I am alone, I feel it clearly. Howard never left. He is there in every decision I make, in every word I bring into the light. My family has changed. I have changed, but I do not turn back, because this time I choose not to be silent. When everything finally settled, I realized that life had not returned me to the starting point. It had placed me on a different path. Not loud, not glamorous, but steadier than I ever thought I could stand at 69. I began to travel. At first, just short flights, small talks at community centers, local libraries where people still gather to listen to one another's stories. Then, gradually, invitations came from different states. I stood before rooms full of gray hair and seasoned eyes, and I told my story, not to shock, but to illuminate. I spoke about the small signs we often overlook, questions about paperwork that come too early, offers made for your parents' own good that carry an unsettling urgency, gentle smiles hiding impatience. I didn't use harsh words. I didn't need to. The people in front of me understood all too well what it felt like to be dismissed simply because of age. Some evenings, after I finished speaking, an older woman would grip my hand tightly and whisper, "Thank you. I was about to sign papers last week." Sometimes men lingered long after the room had nearly emptied, just to ask one question. Where should I start? I didn't offer formulas. I had no miracles. I simply said, start by asking questions. Read carefully. Call someone outside the family for advice. And most important, trust your own instincts, even when they make you uncomfortable. There were times I was tired. Times I wanted to return to a quiet room, close the door, and live the rest of my life in silence. But then I remembered the faces that had listened to me speak. I remembered the stories they carried, stories that had never been told. And I understood that if I stopped, it wouldn't be because I lacked strength. It would be because I was afraid to keep facing the truth. I am no longer a victim. That didn't come from a medal or a title. It came from the moment I stopped asking what I had done wrong and started asking, what can I do next? I am a survivor not because I escaped, but because I stayed with the truth long enough for it to lose its power to hurt me. I learned to love myself in a very different way, not through affirmations in the mirror or luxurious trips, but by allowing myself to rest when I needed to, by saying no without guilt, by understanding that my value is not in what I own or the roles I once played, but in the clarity I have managed to keep until today. Some nights I still think about my son. I remember his laughter as a child, the way he used to hold me tightly whenever he was afraid. I don't deny that longing. I don't push it away. But I also don't let it turn into excuse-making. Love does not mean denying the truth. Being a mother does not mean erasing yourself to preserve a beautiful image of your child at any cost. My life did not end with betrayal. It did not end with loss. Those things are real, and I do not minimize them. But they are not the final period. They are a comma, a necessary pause for me to look back, breathe, and move forward, not as who I was, but as someone who has awakened. Every morning, I stand in front of the mirror and look at the gray-haired woman there with a gentleness I never gave myself before. I don't wish to be younger. I don't need that. I only wish to be clear enough to live the rest of my life without bowing to fear. If there is one thing I want to leave behind, it is this. Age does not make us weak. Silence does. When we speak, even late, we not only protect ourselves, we open a path for others to follow. And if you are reading this, if this story touches you in any way, know that you are not alone. If you'd like, tell me where you are listening from, a small town or a familiar street somewhere. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or simply say that you are still here. If this story helps you see something more clearly, please like it and subscribe so we can continue together through the stories ahead. I am grateful to you for listening, for staying to the very last lines, and for choosing not to turn away. At 69, I do not have a perfect ending. I have a different beginning, and this time, I walk forward with my eyes open, my heart steady, and the truth beside me. You should go home. My son said it right there on the wedding dance floor while I was still holding a glass of champagne I hadn't even set down yet. Not whispered, not softened, not apologized for. Just 4 words, enough to push me out of the room where I had paid for every flower, every song, every forced smile that day. I looked at my daughter-in-law. She didn't say a word, just smiled, a very slight smile. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just a wedding. This was an erasure. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. I stood frozen for a few seconds, as if someone had pulled all the air out of my lungs. The music kept playing behind me, a soft jazz tune from the live band, the trumpet weaving through the cheerful chatter of hundreds of guests. Silk dresses brushed across the polished wooden floor. Glasses clinked together, bright and celebratory. No one noticed me. No one knew that, in that exact moment, I had just been pushed out of my own son's life. My name is Judith Monroe, 63 years old, a widowed mother who has spent more than half her life in Colorado in an old log house sitting on land my family has protected for 3 generations. I used to think I was a strong woman. I believed there was nothing left that could break me. After my husband died 12 years ago, after endless overnight hospital shifts, after crying while paying my son's college tuition bills. But I was wrong. Ethan's wedding, my only son, was held at a luxury resort in Napa Valley, more than 8 hours' drive from my home. Claire said she had always dreamed of a vineyard wedding, where the afternoon sun fell across long tables dressed in white linen, where everything looked like it came straight out of a lifestyle magazine. I nodded the moment Ethan asked if I could help cover some of the cost. In truth, it wasn't some. I paid most of it. I didn't tell anyone that to come up with that money, I drained nearly all of my retirement savings. I didn't say that I picked up extra night shifts at the hospital even when my back hurt so badly I had to lean against the wall just to stand upright. I didn't say that I kept telling myself, this is the last time, the last gift for my son. A mother shouldn't keep score, right? At least that's what I believed. I arrived 2 hours early on the wedding day. The California weather was gently sunny, warm, the scent of ripe grapes drifting in the air. I wore a navy blue, knee-length dress, classic, understated, the exact style Claire had sent me months earlier with a short message, "Formal attire only." The dress cost nearly $400. I stood in front of the mirror for a long time that morning, wondering if I was trying too hard. Then I smiled at myself. The groom's mother should look the part, I thought. The ceremony was flawless. Claire walked down the aisle between rows of white chairs, her fitted lace gown, her blonde hair pinned neatly like a princess. Ethan stood at the end, shoulders straight, eyes bright. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, I cried. I cried out of happiness, out of longing for my husband, who wasn't there to see this day, and out of a naive belief that all my sacrifices had finally meant something. After the ceremony, the reception began. I stood near the dessert table holding my champagne glass, watching Ethan laugh with his friends. I was waiting for a quiet moment to give him the envelope I had brought. Inside was a check I had signed the week before, my hand shaking so badly I had to sign it twice to keep the letters straight. I imagined hugging him, whispering how proud I was. That moment never came. Ethan walked toward me, his face tight. Not the stress of a busy groom, but the firmness of someone who had already made a decision and didn't intend to change it. When he said those words, "You should go home," I thought I must have misheard him. I gave a small, awkward smile, about to ask him to repeat himself, but his eyes left no room for doubt. "Claire is uncomfortable," he added, his voice lower but cold. "You're stressing her out." Around us, everything continued as normal. A middle-aged man tried to dance near the stage, making a few people laugh. A server bent down to straighten a tablecloth. No one looked our way, and maybe that was what hurt the most. I was being kicked out of my son's wedding, and the world didn't even pause for a breath. I wanted to say so many things. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to remind him that I hadn't said a single word to Claire all evening, that I had tried to turn myself into a shadow just to avoid bothering anyone. I wanted to scream that I was his mother, that I had paid for every detail in that room, but nothing came out. I looked at Claire. She was seated at the head table, one hand resting lightly on her wine glass, her lips curved into a small, very small smile. No one else would have noticed anything in it, but I did. I had lived long enough to recognize victory when it hid behind perfect politeness. I nodded. Just a very slight nod. I set my champagne glass down on the dessert table. The base touched the glass surface with a soft, sharp click. I turned, picked up my purse, and walked away. I didn't look back. I didn't search for my son's eyes one last time. I was afraid that if I did, I would collapse right there. The path to the parking lot was long and bright with sun. My heels struck the stone in steady rhythm. Each step felt like a countdown. When the large doors closed behind me, the music and laughter were cut off abruptly. All that remained was silence and the distant sound of cicadas. I stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, forcing my shoulders not to shake. I had left many places in my life. Left the emergency room after overnight shifts, left the cemetery after my husband's funeral, left old rental houses when Ethan was young. But never had I felt erased like this. When I got into the car, my hands tightened around the steering wheel without thinking. I didn't turn on the radio, I didn't call anyone. I just sat there looking back at the glowing resort in the late afternoon light. Inside, my son was raising a glass to his future. And I, the woman who had built the foundation for that future, was left on the outside, like an unnecessary detail. I started the car and drove away. The road out of the valley wound through endless rows of vineyards. The setting sun painted everything in soft shades of gold and orange. It should have been peaceful. But inside me, something was slowly freezing. Not a burst of anger, but a cold, terrifying clarity. I began connecting the dots. Claire's subtle remarks in the months before, the way she always stepped in whenever Ethan and I tried to talk privately, the annoyed looks when I asked about his plans for the future, and then today, "You should go home." It wasn't an impulsive decision, not wedding stress, not a small misunderstanding. It was the result of a process I had refused to see because I trusted motherhood too much. I drove for hours until the sky turned fully dark. With every mile, a thought took shape in my mind, slow but steady like tires rolling along the highway. If I could be erased from my son's wedding today, what would I be erased from tomorrow? The question echoed again and again like a warning, and I had no idea that only a few hours later, that question would become real, in a way I could never have imagined. I drove that long stretch in a strange state, not crying, not shaking, not panicking, just a deep emptiness, as if someone had finally lifted a heavy stone I had carried on my chest for years, leaving my ribs exposed, aching, but also lighter in a strange way. The highway grew emptier. Long lines of yellow light stretched endlessly, like a chain of memories I had tried to neatly fold away throughout my years as a mother. And then, almost by instinct, I began thinking of Ethan from long ago, Not the man who had just asked me to leave his wedding, but the small boy who used to grip my hand tightly when our world fell apart. My husband died when Ethan was 11. It was a winter morning, snow still dusting the lawn in front of our house. Marcus, my husband, collapsed in the kitchen while making coffee, a fast, merciless heart attack that gave us no chance to say goodbye. I still remember the sound of the ceramic mug shattering on the tile floor, Ethan calling for his dad as he ran downstairs, and the heavy silence that followed, the silence that told me nothing would ever be the same again. I became a single mother in the span of one morning. The years that followed blurred into a long stretch without pause. I worked as a nurse at a local hospital, first-day shifts only. But Marcus's life insurance wasn't enough to last, and the mortgage was still there. I took evening shifts, then nights. There were weeks when I worked 6 days straight, 12 hours a day, coming home after Ethan was asleep and leaving again while he was still groggy at the breakfast table. I missed so much. Parent-teacher meetings I attended in my scrubs, school performances where I stood at the back of the auditorium, afraid Ethan would see how exhausted I was. But I never missed the most important thing, being there. I was there when he was sick, when he was bullied at school, when his first real heartbreak left him crying in his room for an entire evening. I learned how to be both mother and father, even though I never believed I was good enough at either. I remember summer evenings when Ethan and I sat at the kitchen table, books spread everywhere. I made tea to stay awake while he worked through math problems, brow furrowed in concentration. Sometimes I was so tired the words on the page blurred, but I stayed, just so he knew I wasn't going anywhere. I remember all the times I said no to myself. No new clothes, no vacations, no renovations I wanted to make to the house. Everything went into Ethan's college fund. When his acceptance letter arrived, I held him and cried, not from pride, but from relief. I had done it, at least up to that point. When Ethan met Claire, he was 26. I first met her over dinner at our house. Claire was polite, proper, but there was an invisible distance I couldn't name. She spoke softly, her smile always measured. Never more, never less. I told myself it was just her personality. Not everyone is warm, and I didn't want to be the meddling mother-in-law. I tried to keep myself on the edges of their lives. I didn't give opinions unless asked. I didn't show up unannounced. I didn't bring up the past. I thought that was respect. But there were small signs I chose to ignore. The way Claire hesitated when I entered a room, how she gripped Ethan's hand a little tighter whenever I asked about their plans, the short, polite but distant replies, as if every conversation with me was an obligation to be completed. When they announced their engagement, I was genuinely happy for my son. When Ethan asked if I could help pay for the wedding, I didn't hesitate. I thought it was an important milestone, something I should contribute to so he could start well. I didn't tell Ethan that the amount was far more than I had expected. I sat down with an old notebook and added everything up. I withdrew from savings. I took out a small loan from the local credit union. I sold my old car and bought a cheaper one. I cut back on things that seemed small. No eating out, no new books, no weekend coffee. I told myself I would make it up later, after the wedding, after things settled. Each time I transferred money to the event planners, Claire sent a short message. "Thank you, Judith." No emojis, no follow-up. I reread those words and told myself I was being too sensitive. A few weeks before the wedding, I began to feel unnecessary. The big decisions had already been made. I was informed, not consulted. When I made a very gentle comment about the location, only that it might be far for older relatives, Claire smiled and said, "We've already decided." not harsh, but final. I swallowed the rest of my words. I kept soothing myself with a single sentence, repeated like a prayer. As long as my son is happy, that's enough. I said it to friends, to relatives, to myself. I believed motherhood meant stepping back when needed, letting go at the right time. I believed that if I stayed quiet long enough, everything would be fine. The truth was, I didn't realize I was being pushed out, little by little. When the wedding day arrived, I thought all the small tensions would disappear, that it would be a day about love and family. I prepared myself to smile, to stand behind the scenes, to be the kind of mother I was supposed to be. Quiet, proud, undemanding. I never imagined I would be asked to leave. Now, driving through the darkness, I began to see every piece with new clarity. Details I once thought harmless arranged themselves into a picture so clear it made my skin go cold. I realized I had confused sacrifice with self-erasure. I believed love meant giving without conditions, but I had never asked, what happens when that giving is no longer valued? I didn't know then that the wedding was only the first step. But as my tires rolled steadily over the road and old memories settled into silence, a sense of unease began to grow, slow, heavy, impossible to shake. Something was coming, something bigger, colder, and deep down I understood that the price I had paid for that special day was not the final price yet. I kept driving through the night, letting the road pull me farther away from that glowing vineyard valley. My headlights swept across road signs, dark rows of trees standing still on either side of the highway. The dashboard clock crept closer to midnight. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence in the car was so thick I could hear my own breathing, the steady hiss of tires on dew-damp pavement. At times I felt like misplaced luggage on the wrong conveyor belt, pushed along, left behind, no one looking back. The feeling didn't explode into anger or spill into tears. It lingered, stubborn and dull, like a bruise beneath the skin. I thought about the moment Ethan spoke those words, about the way his eyes avoided mine, about Claire's barely there smile. It all replayed in my mind without sound or color, leaving only the cold shape of the truth. I stopped at a small roadside gas station to refuel. The convenience store glowed under fluorescent lights, smelling of burnt coffee and stale pastries. The young cashier smiled out of habit as I handed over my card, unaware that the woman standing in front of her had just been erased from a family she herself had built. I bought a bottle of water, took a small sip, then set it on the passenger seat. My throat was dry, but I wasn't thirsty. I just needed to pause long enough to prove to myself that I was still moving forward, that the wheels were still turning. When I pulled back onto the road, the air grew cooler. The highway gave way to narrower roads winding through pine forests. I recognized the familiar scent of the mountains, sap, damp earth, night air heavy with mist. That smell guided me home, faster than any road sign ever could. And then after the final bend, I saw the old wooden gate appear in my headlights. The house stood there, as it had for decades, unpretentious, unpolished. Just a 2-story log house with a sloped roof, a wide porch, and the warm yellow glow of the porch light I always left on when I traveled. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel. The silence here was different from the silence on the road. It wasn't empty. It was dense, deep, filled with memory. I stepped out of the car. Gravel crunched under my heels. The cold air raised goosebumps on my skin, but I didn't rush inside. I stood there, looking at the house the way you look at someone you love after a long absence. Dark windows, the wooden porch swing creaking softly in the night breeze, everything familiar, painfully so. This wasn't just a house. This was where my grandfather stood every morning with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the mountains. This was where my father hammered each plank of the barn out back, sweat dripping onto the ground in the heat of summer. And this was where Marcus and I carried Ethan home from the hospital, a tiny bundle wrapped in white, crying when the cold air touched his cheeks. This land, 40 acres, was the greatest emotional inheritance of my life, not because of its market value, though I knew it was worth a great deal, but because every inch carried the footsteps of people I loved. Every tall oak at the forest's edge was planted by my father when I was still a girl. Every wooden fence bore my grandfather's hammer marks. And this house. Marcus repaired the porch roof with his own hands in the final autumn before he passed. I opened the door and stepped inside. I didn't turn on the lights right away. I let myself stand in the dark, letting my eyes adjust to the space. The smell of old wood, the soap I used to mop the floors, the faint warmth left behind from a long day. All of it wrapped around me like an invisible blanket. I set my bag down on the chair and hung my coat on the hook by the door. Every movement was slow, as if I were afraid of disturbing the fragile quiet that covered the house. I walked into the living room. The armchair Marcus used to sit in was by the window. The coffee table had an old scratch on the corner, where Ethan once dropped a toy car when he was little. On the mantel were photo frames faded by time. I didn't look closely, but I knew every picture there. I didn't need light to see them. I sat down in the armchair, my hand resting on the armrest worn smooth by years of use. In that moment, the memory of Marcus felt so vivid I could almost hear his voice, low, slow, always carrying a hint of a smile even when he talked about serious things. I clearly remembered the last night we sat here together, talking about the future. Ethan was already grown then, getting ready for college. Marcus worried that I would struggle on my own if he were gone. I brushed it off, told him he was thinking too much. "Judith," he said, his voice weak but firm. "No matter what happens, you have to hold on to this land. Don't let anyone turn it into something that can be bought and sold. It's our family." I nodded. Back then, I never imagined that promise would become so heavy. That night, I didn't cry. The tears felt stuck somewhere, refusing to fall. I sat in the dark for a long time, listening only to the steady ticking of the wall clock. Each tick sounded like a step backward in time, carrying me to the years when I still believed family was something nothing could shake. I made a cup of tea, but let it go cold on the table. I didn't feel like drinking it. I just needed something in my hands to remind myself that I was still here, in this house, on this land. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees, creating a familiar whispering sound. Normally, that sound comforted me. Tonight, it made me feel smaller than ever. I stood up and stepped out onto the back porch. The night sky stretched wide, full of stars. Pale moonlight fell over the distant field, where wild grass swayed gently. I remembered summer evenings when Ethan ran barefoot across the lawn, laughing as Marcus chased after him. I remembered the sound of Mom calling out from far away, full of trust. Those memories didn't come to comfort me. They came to remind me that something had changed forever. A vague but unmistakable sense settled in my chest. What happened today wasn't the end. It felt like the first crack of thunder signaling a storm forming far offshore. The surface was still calm, the sky still clear, but the air had changed. I went back inside, locked the door, and turned the lights off again. I didn't want light. I wanted the house to stay like this, silent, waiting. I went upstairs, changed my clothes, and lay down on the bed without pulling the covers up. The ceiling appeared dimly in the moonlight slipping through the curtains. I stared at it for a long time, letting my thoughts drift without clinging to any single one. Before slipping into a shallow, restless sleep, a thought slid into my mind, light but sharp as a blade. If my son could throw me out of his wedding, what else would he be willing to take from me? I didn't know the answer, but somewhere deep inside, I knew that the calm of that night was only a thin shell, and I was afraid, not of the dark, not of being alone, but because I was beginning to understand that the real storm was still ahead. I woke up just as the sky began to lighten. Sunlight, thin as a veil of mist, slipped through the curtains and fell onto the cold wooden floor. My body felt heavy, not from lack of sleep, but from a deep weariness inside, as if I had carried an invisible weight through the entire night. I sat up slowly, set my feet on the floor, and listened as the house woke up with me. The soft creak of wood, the wind slipping through the window frame, the first birds calling from the distant pine trees. Everything looked normal, suspiciously normal. I made coffee, a habit I never broke. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and familiar. I leaned against the counter, mug in hand, and looked out the back window. Dew still clung to the grass. The old wooden barn stood quiet in the distance. There was no sign that the day before I had been pushed out of my son's wedding, as if it had all been a bad dream washed away by morning light. My phone vibrated just as I set the mug down. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. For a brief moment, I thought, naively, that he was calling to apologize, that he had reconsidered after his wedding night, that he realized what he had done was wrong. My heart skipped, not because of grand hope, but because of the old reflex of a mother always ready to forgive. I answered. "Hi, Mom," Ethan said, his voice so normal it stopped me short. No hesitation, no uncertainty, no trace of the emotions I had carried all night. "Did you make it home safely?" I was silent for a second. "Yes," I said. My voice was dry but steady. "I'm home." "Good," he continued, as if checking something off a list. "Hey, Mom, do you have a minute to talk?" I looked out the window again, where sunlight had begun to touch the trunk of the old oak tree. "I'm listening." There was a very brief pause on the other end. Then Ethan spoke, his tone turning strangely upbeat, like when he was little and about to share a new idea. "Claire and I talked last night. We think it's time to talk about the land." I frowned but said nothing. "The land paperwork," Ethan went on a bit faster, as if afraid I might interrupt. "Can you send me a copy? Or better yet, the original? I need to look it over." It felt like someone had just dumped a bucket of cold water over my head. The paperwork. "For the land?" I repeated, not to question him, but to give myself time to understand what he had just said. "Yeah," he replied casually. "Our land. The 40 acres. I figured you knew what I meant." I leaned back against the counter, my hand gripping the edge of the marble. Part of me still couldn't believe this conversation was happening. Less than 12 hours after I'd been told to leave his wedding, my son was calling to ask about property documents. "What for?" I asked. My voice was low and even, unfamiliar even to me. Ethan let out a small, relieved breath, as if we had finally reached the important part. "Well, to talk plans. You know, leaving land unused is a waste. Claire and I think we could develop it." "Develop it?" I repeated. "Yeah," he said, growing more animated. "Build a few houses, maybe divide it into lots. Sell them. The market is really good right now, Mom. People are willing to pay a lot for land like that, especially near forest and mountains." I closed my eyes. The image of the old barn, the crooked fence, the oak trees my father planted appeared so clearly it hurt. "Ethan," I said slowly, "you're talking about our family land." "I know," he replied, still calm. "But look at it, Mom. It's too much for one person. Maintenance is exhausting, and you're not young anymore." That sentence, "you're not young anymore," landed like a clean cut. Not cruel, not angry, just a truth spoken too easily. "Claire and her family know some people in construction," Ethan continued. "Her dad has a friend in real estate. Her uncle did a similar project in Arizona. We've already talked it through a bit. If we move fast, we could split the land, build vacation-style homes, and sell them in a few years." I opened my eyes. The familiar kitchen suddenly felt foreign, like I was standing in someone else's house. "So, you've already planned everything?" "Not exactly," Ethan said quickly, correcting himself. "Just preliminary talk, to see what you think." I gave a soft laugh, empty of humor. "Are you asking me, or informing me?" There was a brief silence. Then Ethan said, his voice lower, more practical. "Mom, I just want what's best for everyone. This is a big opportunity. If it sells, you'll have money to live more comfortably. You could move somewhere smaller, easier to manage." I pictured myself in a senior living community, trimming artificial grass, playing bingo on Wednesday afternoons. I pictured this land leveled, the oak trees cut down, the barn dismantled, all of it wrapped up in 2 words: big opportunity. "What does Claire think?" I asked, even though I already knew. "She's very supportive," Ethan answered immediately. "Her family, too. Everyone thinks this is the logical move." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. The final pieces fell into place. The lavish wedding, my quiet removal, this morning's call. Nothing was scattered anymore. It all lined up into one cold, straight line. "So," Ethan continued, his tone slightly pressing, "can you send the paperwork this week, so we can review the details?" I took a deep breath. The morning air suddenly felt heavy. "Do you know," I asked slowly, "that your grandfather spent nearly his entire life holding on to that land?" "I know the history, Mom," Ethan replied, a hint of impatience creeping in. "But we have to live in the present. We can't cling to the past forever." That sentence ended all remaining doubt inside me. The wedding wasn't the destination. It was just a stepping stone, a stage dressed up, beautifully enough to hide the real goal behind it. And I, the mother, was simply an obstacle that needed to be removed so the plan could move forward smoothly. I looked down at my hands. The veins stood out, the skin thin with age. These were the hands that had changed bandages, given injections, worked without rest. The hands that had held my son's hand when he was afraid. And now these same hands were being asked to give everything away. "Ethan," I said, my voice so calm it surprised even me. "I need time." "Time?" he repeated. "How long?" "For now," I said. "I'll think about it." There was a light sigh on the other end. "Fine, but think fast. The market doesn't wait for anyone." I ended the call before he could say anything else. The kitchen fell silent again. The wall clock ticked steadily, reminding me that time kept moving, no matter what had just happened. I stood there for a long while, watching sunlight slowly fill the room, touch the table, the cabinets, the old photo near the door, the one of Marcus standing on this land, smiling gently, his hand resting on Ethan's shoulder when he was still a boy. I realized then that a mother's love can be weighed and measured like any other asset. And that morning in my familiar kitchen, I understood that I hadn't just lost my place in my son's wedding. I had been placed on the scale. After that call, I didn't do anything right away. I didn't call Ethan back. I didn't text him. I just stood in the kitchen for a long time, letting the wall clock keep counting seconds as it had for decades. Then I put on my jacket and stepped outside. Mornings on this land always had a beauty of their own. Sunlight cut through the pine trees at an angle, falling onto ground still damp with dew. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wild grass and sap. I walked slowly along the familiar dirt path leading to the field behind the house. Each step felt like it was pulling me backward through time, returning me to days when everything here was tied to the voices of people long gone. My grandfather bought this land in the early 1950s. He had just returned from the war, carrying nothing but a small amount of money saved from years of hard labor. He chose this place because it was wild, because people thought no one would want to live on land so remote, rocky, and forested. But to him, it was a beginning. He built a small log house with his own hands, planted the first trees to mark the boundaries. He told my father, "Land won't betray you as long as you don't betray it." My father grew up here. He expanded the house, built the barn, put up fences. He planted oak trees along the small creek, believing that one day his grandchildren would sit beneath their shade. When I was a child, I thought this land was the whole world. I ran barefoot through the grass, scraped my knees, got bandaged by my father, then ran off again. Every scratch, every scar belonged to a specific corner of this land. They never disappeared, only faded with time. Marcus, my husband, fell in love with this land the first time he stepped onto it. He wasn't born here, but he chose to stay. He repaired the roof, reinforced the foundation, expanded the front porch. He planted fruit trees, saying Ethan would grow up alongside them. And when Ethan was born, this land witnessed my son's first steps, his laughter echoing across the fields. All of that. Those afternoons, those long winters, those sweltering summers couldn't be measured in money. They had no market price. No contract recorded them. But they existed, clearly and stubbornly, in every layer of soil, every piece of wood, every memory I carried. And yet, in that morning call, Ethan had called it unused land. I replayed those words in my mind one by one like a slow knife. Unused land. As if this place were nothing but an empty space waiting to be filled with concrete and profit. As if the years my family poured sweat, tears, and even blood into it had never existed. I walked up to the old wooden barn. Some of the boards were weathered, but the structure was still solid. My father used to say that if you build something carefully from the start, it can last longer than a lifetime. I placed my hand on the rough wooden wall, feeling each small crack beneath my fingertips. This wasn't unused land. This was living history. When I turned back toward the house, my phone vibrated again. Ethan. I hesitated, then answered. "Have you thought about it yet?" he asked immediately without easing in. "I'm standing on the land right now," I replied, my voice lower. "The land you called unused." There was a brief pause on the other end. Then Ethan spoke, his voice carrying restrained irritation. "Don't make this complicated. I'm just talking realistically." "Your reality," I said. "The market's reality," he corrected. "Look at it, Mom. You're here alone. Maintenance costs money. The grass grows wild, the barn is old. Everything needs fixing. You could live more comfortably if you moved." "Moved where?" I asked, even though I already knew. "Claire found some really nice senior living communities," Ethan said, his voice softening in a forced way. "They have care services, activities, social events. You wouldn't have to worry so much anymore. It would be better for you." I closed my eyes. In that moment, I saw myself packaged into a future someone else had designed. Neat, convenient, out of the way. An older woman who needed to be placed so she wouldn't interfere with younger people's plans. "How long have you been talking about this with Claire?" I asked. Ethan was silent for a few seconds. That silence was answer enough. "We're just thinking about the future," he said afterward. "Yours too." I let out a short laugh, this time without bitterness. It was low, brief, final. "You're thinking about your future," I said, "and I'm just an inconvenient variable." "That's not true," Ethan protested quickly. "You're reading into it. You always get too emotional." Emotional? The word hung between us like a verdict. I realized with painful clarity that in this conversation, I was no longer his mother. I was a problem to be solved. "Ethan," I said slowly, deliberately, "do you know why your father wanted to keep this land?" "Because of feelings," Ethan replied, impatience in his voice. "I get it. But feelings don't pay bills." "But feelings gave you the foundation to stand where you are," I said. "Without this land, without the people who protected it before you, you wouldn't have the life you have now." "That's the past," Ethan cut in. "You keep clinging to it. You need to be more realistic." I took a deep breath. For the first time since my husband died, since I pushed myself to raise my son alone, I felt something with absolute clarity. I was being pushed out of my own family story. "I'm not sending the paperwork," I said. There was dead silence on the other end. "What?" Ethan asked, his voice dropping. "I said no," I repeated. "This land is not for sale, not to be divided, not for you and your wife's family to profit from." Ethan's tone changed completely. No longer casual, no longer upbeat. It sharpened, tightened. "You don't have the right to be that selfish. I'm your son. This is my future, too." "You don't have the right to take something you don't respect," I replied. "So you're choosing the land over me?" Ethan almost shouted. The question hit me straight in the chest, but this time I didn't step back. "I'm choosing to keep my promise," I said, "and I'm choosing self-respect." Claire was right. Ethan snapped, his voice full of anger. "You've always been controlling. You always think you know what's best." I tightened my grip on the phone. "If controlling means not letting you destroy our family's legacy," I said, "then I accept that." The call ended in heavy silence. No goodbye, no farewell. I lowered my hand and stared at the screen as it went dark. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but from a truth that had just been laid bare. The conflict was no longer simmering. It had officially erupted. I stood there, between the house and the land I had protected my entire life. And for the first time, I understood that this fight was no longer just about property. It was about boundaries, about a mother who had sacrificed too much, finally standing up and saying no, even if the price was the very blood relationship she once believed nothing could ever break. The call ended, but its echo didn't fade. It hung in the house like a thin haze, seeping into every corner, making it impossible to pretend that everything would somehow settle on its own like before. I made lunch, that day in silence, ate a few bites out of obligation, then washed the dishes, my mind completely elsewhere. I knew it clearly. Ethan wasn't going to stop there. And I was right. That afternoon, my phone started buzzing. The first message came from Ethan, short, carrying the familiar tone he used whenever he wanted to soften me. "Mom, I'm sorry I lost my temper earlier. I'm just worried about you. Can we talk again?" I read it, set the phone down, and didn't reply. A few minutes later, another message came in. You don't understand. Everything I'm doing is for our family's future. Then a missed call. Then 2. Then 3. I let the phone sit on the kitchen table, vibrating and going silent again, like a living thing trying to pull my attention. I thought about the times Ethan was little, crying for candy or toys, and how I learned that sometimes if you didn't give in right away, the whining would pass. But this was no longer a child. This was a grown man, and what he wanted wasn't a toy. It was my entire life. By evening, the tone of the messages changed. You're making everything worse. I don't understand why you're being so stubborn. Claire is really upset. Her family doesn't understand you at all. A deep exhaustion settled over me. Not physical exhaustion, but the kind that comes from a person who has spent a lifetime trying to please others, only to be condemned for finally stopping. The call came around 9 p.m. This time, I answered. Judith, Ethan said, not calling me Mom, just my name. A small detail, but enough to tell me he had crossed into another territory. You're backing me into a corner. You backed yourself in, I replied, my voice so calm it surprised even me. No, Ethan shot back. You have all the power. You're holding the paperwork. You're holding the property. You're controlling everything. Controlling. That word again. That property isn't yours, I said. At least not yet. But I'm your son, Ethan nearly shouted. Who are you going to leave it to if not me? The question wasn't curiosity. It was a veiled threat, wrapped in reason. I could hear his breathing on the other end, fast and shallow, as if he were trying to convince himself he was right. Ethan, I said slowly, I've already told you. I'm not selling the land. There was a heavy pause. Then his voice shifted completely, dropping lower, colder. Then don't blame me, Ethan said, if things go too far. What do you mean? I asked. I'm just giving you a warning, he replied. The law won't always be on your side. I have my rights. I ended the call. I didn't shake. I didn't cry. But something inside me closed. That was the moment I realized emotion was no longer our shared language. It had been replaced by strategy. The next day, Claire called. I stared at her name on the screen for a long time before answering. Part of me was curious what she would say. Another part of me was already familiar with that pleasant tone people use when they want something. Judith, Claire said gently, almost warmly. I just wanted to talk for a moment. Nothing tense. Go ahead, I replied. I think there's been a misunderstanding, she continued. Ethan and I respect you very much, truly, but you have to understand, we're building our own life. Respect? I repeated, unable to hide the edge in my voice. When exactly did you show me that respect? There was a very slight pause. Then Claire laughed softly, the sound carefully practiced. You're being overly sensitive. That wedding day? It was just stress. I never meant to push you out. But you did, I said, and you never apologized. I am apologizing now, Claire said quickly. I just hope we can talk like adults, calmly, rationally. Rationally, a very convenient word often used to cover coldness. What do you want? I asked plainly. I want you to look at the bigger picture, Claire said. That land, it's too much for you. I'm worried about your health, really. You can't live out there alone forever. The words sounded painfully familiar, exactly what Ethan had said, as if they had sat together and rehearsed every argument, every sentence. And if you were truly worried about me, I said, you wouldn't have started your marriage by pushing your mother-in-law out of the wedding. Claire's voice stiffened slightly, but only for a moment. Judith, I think you're putting emotions over reason. You're acting selfishly." Selfish. The word was spoken lightly, like a feather, but it landed like a stone. I suddenly understood that in this story the roles had completely reversed. I, the one who had given everything, was now the selfish one. And they, the ones demanding, saw themselves as victims. "You've said enough," I replied. "There's nothing left to discuss." "Judith." I hung up. In the days that followed, the pressure didn't ease. It intensified. Messages came constantly, sometimes from Ethan, sometimes from Claire, sometimes from unknown numbers I guessed were relatives on Claire's side. The content circled the same points again and again. I was overreacting. I was controlling. I was ruining my son's future. Some nights I picked up my phone and reread the messages, wondering if I really was wrong. Was I clinging too tightly to a past that no longer fit? Was I making things difficult for my son because I was afraid of loss? But then I stepped outside, looked at the land stretching under the moonlight, and the answer became clear. I wasn't afraid of losing the land. I was afraid of losing myself. One morning, after waking up to more than a dozen missed calls, I did something I had never done before. I turned my phone off completely. No vibration, no notifications, no screen lighting up. The house became strangely quiet, as if I could finally breathe. I made tea, sat on the back porch, and watched the wind ripple through the tall grass. For the first time in days, I didn't feel pulled in every direction by other people. In that quiet, I began to think, not about how to calm Ethan, but about what I wanted my future to look like. I had lived too long in the role of the one who sacrifices, the one who gives in, the one who steps back so others can move forward. But I wasn't young anymore. I didn't have time left to fix choices born out of fear. A very small, very faint thought began to take shape. I didn't name it. I didn't dare say it out loud, but it was there, like a seed planted in dry soil after the first rain. If they could make plans behind my back, then maybe I needed a plan of my own. I didn't know then how fast that seed would grow. I only knew that in the moment I chose silence and a temporary retreat, I wasn't running away. I was preparing. I kept my phone off for 2 full days, not to punish anyone, but because I needed to hear my own voice again. The familiar sounds of this land returned, the wind moving through the pines, the barn door creaking as the temperature shifted, my own footsteps on the worn path leading to the forest's edge. In that quiet, one thought grew clearer and clearer, no longer just a seed. If I did nothing, they would do it for me. Ethan and Claire weren't hiding their intentions anymore. They weren't speaking the language of emotion, but the language of plans, of profit, of what was reasonable. And what frightened me most wasn't that they wanted to sell the land. It was how they talked about it, as if this place were nothing more than an obstacle, a burden that needed to be removed so the road ahead could be clear. I had seen too many patients at the hospital lose control over their own lives simply because they were one step too slow. I had always believed that would never happen to me. But now, as my son began talking about rights and the law, I understood that I could no longer rely on motherhood to protect what mattered. On the 3rd morning, I turned my phone back on. The screen lit up almost instantly, showing dozens of missed calls and unread messages. I didn't open them. I searched for one name in my contacts, Rebecca Sloan. Rebecca was the lawyer who had helped me handle the paperwork when Marcus died. She didn't talk much, didn't circle around issues, and always looked straight at the problem. I hadn't seen her in years, but as I pressed the call button, I knew this was the call I needed to make. "Sloan Law Office," a woman's voice answered. "This is Judith Monroe," I said. "I need to see Rebecca as soon as possible." There was a brief pause. Then Rebecca's voice came on the line. "Judith, it's been a long time. Are you all right?" "I need to talk," I said, "about the land." Her tone turned serious. "Can you come to the office this afternoon?" I drove into town in the early afternoon. The familiar road past small shops, the old cafe, the post office where I used to take Ethan to mail letters to his grandparents when he was little. This town had witnessed every stage of my life, from a newly married young woman to a busy mother to a widow trying to stand her ground. And now I was coming back with a different kind of fear, heavier, because it came from my own blood. Rebecca's office was on the second floor of an old brick building. The wooden stairs creaked softly under my feet. When I stepped inside, I smelled paper, ink, and coffee. A very law office smell, very practical. Rebecca stood when she saw me, her brown hair streaked with gray pulled into a neat bun, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "Sit down," she said, motioning to the chair across from her desk. "You look tired." I gave a faint smile. "I probably am." I told her everything. I didn't leave out a single detail. The wedding, the words, "You should go home," the call the next morning, the messages, the accusations of selfishness and control. I even told her about the suggestion to move me into a senior living community as a solution for everyone. As I spoke, Rebecca didn't interrupt. She just listened, occasionally jotting down short notes. When I finished, the room was quiet for a few seconds. Rebecca set her pen down and leaned back. "What's your biggest fear?" she asked. I didn't have to think long. "That they'll destroy the land," I said. "That everything my family built will disappear. That one day I'll be standing there watching bulldozers flatten the place where my grandfather planted trees, where my husband once stood smiling with our son." Rebecca nodded slowly. "Then we need to make sure that never happens." She pulled a folder from her drawer and flipped through a few pages. "You're still the sole legal owner of the land. Ethan has no legal rights to it, unless you transfer it or you pass away without clear arrangements." "I know," I said, "but I don't want everything to depend on unless." Rebecca studied me for a moment as if weighing something. Then she said, "There is a way." She began explaining about a conservation trust, a type of trust designed for land. The property would be placed into the trust with very specific conditions. It could not be sold, could not be divided, could not be commercially developed. Its sole purpose would be preservation, for nature, for the community, for future generations. "The most important thing," Rebecca said, slowing her voice so I would hear every word, "is that once you do this, it can't be undone. Once the land is in the trust, it no longer belongs to you personally. You won't be able to take it back or change your mind." I fell silent. The thought tightened my chest. This land had belonged to my family for so many years. The idea that it would no longer be in my name, even for protection, made me hesitate. "How will Ethan react?" I asked. Rebecca was blunt. "He won't be happy, and you need to be prepared for strong opposition." I looked down at my hands, fingers that had trembled while signing so many documents over a lifetime, but never like this. "If I don't do it," I said softly, "I'll live in fear forever." Rebecca nodded. "That's right. And you also need to understand, doing this isn't revenge. It's setting boundaries." Boundaries. The word echoed in my mind like a belated reminder. I had lived my whole life without clearly drawing boundaries with my son. I thought love meant leaving the door wide open. I was wrong. Without boundaries, love gets invaded. I sat there for a long time, weighing everything. Ethan as a little boy, his hand wrapped in mine as we crossed the street. Marcus standing on the land, telling me I had to protect it at all costs. And Claire's faint smile when I was pushed out of the wedding. "I need time," I said. Rebecca didn't press me. "Of course, but you should know that time is also a factor. The pressure from them won't ease." I stood up, took my bag, and prepared to leave. Before opening the door, I turned back to Rebecca. "If I decide to do it," I asked, "will you help me?" She smiled. Not a comforting smile, but a steady one. "That's my job." On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. I drove slowly, letting each thought settle. When I turned onto the dirt road leading back to the house, I stopped the car, got out, and looked around at the familiar land. The afternoon light fell low, tinting the grass gold. A light breeze carried the scent of pine resin. I placed my hand on the trunk of the oldest oak tree and felt the rough bark beneath my fingers. "I'll protect you," I whispered, not knowing whether I was speaking to the tree, to Marcus, or to myself. In that moment, the hesitation inside me began to fade. I hadn't signed anything yet, but I had done something more important. For the first time in my life, I knew exactly where my boundary was, and I was ready to defend it. I didn't return to the law office the very next day. I needed one more night, not to hesitate, but to be sure this decision wasn't born from anger or hurt. I had lived long enough to know the difference between a reaction and a choice. Reactions are impulsive. Choices have to stand even after emotions settle. That night, I slept very little. I didn't toss and turn, and I didn't dream. I just lay still, listening to the house breathe. The wind tapped softly against the window frame. Tree branches brushed the porch roof. Those familiar sounds had been the backdrop of my life for decades, and now they seemed to be witnessing me reach a crossroads no one else could walk for me. The next morning, I made coffee, drank it slowly, then got dressed. Not anything formal or elaborate, just the light brown jacket I usually wore when going into town, the shoes that had been with me for years. I looked at myself in the mirror before leaving. That face had wrinkles and weariness, but no longer confusion. I nodded to myself, like a quiet confirmation. When I walked into Rebecca Sloane's office for the second time that week, she looked at me and immediately knew I was ready. There was no long, small talk. Rebecca pulled a thick folder from the drawer and set it on the desk. Crisp white pages, black printed text, dry legal language. But I knew that inside was the fate of the land, and also of my relationship with my son. "Before we begin," Rebecca said slowly, "you need to hear this one more time. When you sign, the land will be transferred into a conservation trust. It will no longer be personal property. It won't belong to you, to Ethan, or to any heir." "I understand," I said. "You won't be able to change this decision later," she continued, "even if you want to." "I understand," I repeated, and this time my voice didn't shake. Rebecca studied me for a few seconds, then nodded. She slid the pen toward me. I took it. The pen felt heavier than I expected, not because of its weight, but because of what it meant. I looked at the printed line at the top of the page. Judith Monroe, grantor, the one who transfers, the one who gives authority, the one who ends one chapter and begins another. I signed. Blue ink appeared on the paper, familiar yet strange. I signed the first page, then the second. Each time I put the pen down, it felt like I was loosening invisible cords that had bound me for years. There was pain, yes, a dull ache like pulling a tooth that had been loose for a long time. But right after came a spreading sense of relief, slow and steady. Rebecca turned the page. I signed again. Long, detailed, dry clauses. No selling, no subdivision, no commercial development, no transfer, no exceptions, no conditions. The land would be protected forever, not by emotion, but by law. On one page, in the middle of the file, there was a short paragraph that made me stop. The property shall be removed from the grantor's estate and shall not be subject to inheritance. The property would be removed from the will. I read that sentence twice, then a third time. This was the moment I understood very clearly. With this signature, I wasn't just protecting the land, I was also ending every hope Ethan had ever held, even the ones he never spoke aloud. I was closing the door my son believed would always be open to him, no matter what he did. I closed my eyes for a brief second. I thought of Ethan as a boy, standing on this grass, holding a wooden stick like a sword, declaring that one day he would protect our home. I thought of Marcus, his voice low and weak in his final days, his hand in mine as he said, "Don't let anyone take it away." I thought of my grandfather, of my father, men, who didn't leave me much money, but left me a foundation no one had the right to destroy. I opened my eyes. "Keep signing," I told myself. I signed the remaining pages slowly but firmly, no rushing, no hesitation. When I signed the final page, Rebecca placed her hand on the folder as if to confirm it was done. "It's finished," she said. "From this moment on, the land belongs to the Conservation Trust. It's protected by law." I set the pen down. A brief emptiness passed through me, not from loss, but from something ending. And right after it came a peace I hadn't felt in a very long time. "What do I do next?" I asked. "Nothing," Rebecca replied. "The rest is on me, but you should prepare yourself." "I am prepared," I said. On the drive home, I went slower than usual. I didn't turn on the radio. I let my thoughts drift freely without grabbing onto them. I knew that when Ethan found out, his reaction would be fierce. I knew Claire wouldn't stay quiet. I knew accusations, threats, pleading, all of it would come. But I also knew something else. I was no longer standing on unstable ground. When the car turned onto the dirt road leading home, I stopped once again, as I had been doing these past days. I stepped out and stood in the land, bathed in late afternoon light. The wind moved through the tall grass. In the distance, the old wooden barn still stood, quiet and enduring. I placed a hand on my chest and felt my steady heartbeat. "I did the right thing," I whispered, needing no one else to hear. In that moment, I felt the change inside me clearly. I was no longer the woman waiting for her child's approval, no longer the mother afraid that a firm decision would make her lose everything. I still loved Ethan. That hadn't changed. But I was no longer willing to trade myself to preserve an image of family that no longer existed. I went inside, hung up my jacket, and made tea. Those small, familiar tasks suddenly felt steadier, as if everything had found its proper order again. I sat down in Marcus's armchair and looked out the window. The light faded outside, leaving a calm, deep blue. The storm hadn't arrived yet. I knew that. But when it did, I wouldn't be standing in the open anymore. I had signed. And that signature, irrevocable, was exactly what kept me standing. I knew that call would come. I just didn't know it would come so quickly. The phone rang while I was standing on the back porch, watering the wildflower bed Marcus had planted years ago. The day was slipping toward evening, the sunlight softening, a light breeze making the petals tremble. The scene was so peaceful it was almost cruel, because I knew very well this peace was about to be torn apart. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. I didn't answer right away. I turned off the hose, set it neatly aside, wiped my hands on my pants, and only then picked up the phone. Not because I wanted to prolong the tension, but because I wanted to be truly ready. "Mom," Ethan said the moment I answered. His voice was no longer normal, no longer angry, but breaking in a different way. Please tell me this is all a misunderstanding." I leaned against the porch post and looked out at the land sinking into the colors of dusk. "What are you talking about?" I asked, even though we both knew the answer. "Rebecca Sloan just called me," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "She said you signed something, that the land doesn't belong to you anymore. Tell me, Mom, this isn't true, right?" I took a deep breath, not to gather courage, but to keep my voice steady. "It's not a misunderstanding," I said. "I transferred the land into a conservation trust." On the other end of the line, silence crashed down, a thick silence so heavy I could hear my son's ragged breathing. "No," Ethan whispered. "No, you can't do that. You don't have the right." "It's my legal right," I replied, "and I did it." Ethan's voice broke completely. "Mom, you don't understand. You just destroyed everything, all our plans. Plans you never once asked me about," I cut in, my voice still even. "Plans you thought you could carry out after throwing me out of your own wedding." I heard a strange sound in the background. Footsteps. A woman's voice, sharp and urgent. "Ethan, what's going on?" Claire's voice rang out, not quiet at all. "Who are you talking to?" "Mom," Ethan said quickly, as if afraid I'd disappear. "You have to fix this. I'm begging you. This is too big." "Put Claire on," I said. There was a brief hesitation. Then I heard the phone change hands. "Judith?" Claire spoke. Her voice was no longer gentle. It was sharp, tight, nearly shaking with anger. "I don't understand why you would do this." "You understand perfectly," I replied. "You just don't like it." "This is incredibly selfish," Claire said, each word heavy. "You're not thinking about Ethan. You're not thinking about our family." "I have thought about it," I said slowly. "I thought long and hard, and I chose to protect what my family built instead of letting it be destroyed for someone else's benefit." "Destroyed?" Claire laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I call that development. I call that the future." "A future where I'm pushed aside," I said, "just like you did at the wedding." I heard a sharp breath on the other end. "Judith, you can't keep clinging to that," Claire said. "That's in the past." "It's in the past for you," I replied. "Not for me." Ethan grabbed the phone back. "Mom, I'm begging you," he said, his voice nearly collapsing. "You can change this decision. I know you can." "No," I said, just one word, clear. "I can't. I'll sue," Ethan blurted out. Immediately after, he seemed to regret it. I don't want to, but you're leaving me no choice." "You can try," I replied, "but you won't win." "I'm your son," Ethan almost shouted. "I have inheritance rights." "You don't have rights to something you don't respect," I said. "And Rebecca already explained that to you, that conservation trust is irreversible." On the other end, I heard Claire mutter a curse under her breath. "We'll find another lawyer," she said, loud enough for me to hear. "There has to be a way." I closed my eyes for a second. "You can ask as many lawyers as you want," I said when I opened them. "The truth doesn't change." "Mom," Ethan choked, "you're choosing the land over me." I didn't answer right away. I looked at the land stretching out in front of me, the rows of trees standing still in the fading light. I remembered the moment Ethan looked at me at the wedding, his eyes distant and hard. I remembered the feeling of being told to leave, like an unwelcome guest. "You already chose, Ethan," I said at last. "You chose when you said you should go home. You chose when you called this land abandoned. You chose when you treated me like an obstacle." "I didn't think you'd go this far," Ethan said, his voice shattered. "I didn't think you'd dare." "That's the problem," I cut in. "You didn't think about me at all. You just assumed I would always give in." There was a long silence. This time, no one spoke. I could hear Ethan breathing heavily, hear Claire whispering angrily somewhere in the background. I knew that in this moment, everything in my son's mind was collapsing, not just his plans, but his image of the mother he believed would never say no. "Mom," Ethan said very softly, like he used to when he was little, "I'm scared." I tightened my grip on the phone. My heart ached, but it didn't waver. "You're scared because you lost control," I said, "and I've lived in fear for too long." "So this is really it?" Ethan asked. "That depends on you," I replied, "but this land is settled." I heard a quiet sob, then Claire snapped sharply, "Ethan, stop begging, she's not worth it." That sentence, more than any threat, made everything brutally clear. "I've heard enough," I said. "We'll talk later if there's anything left to talk about." I ended the call. My hand trembled slightly, but not from regret. I sat down on the wooden chair on the porch and watched the last light of day fade. In my chest was a deep sadness, the sadness of a mother realizing the child she raised no longer stood on her side. But at the same time, another feeling rose, a cold clarity. What I had just done wasn't the cause of this collapse. It was only the result. Cause and effect were taking shape, and I knew that from this moment on, none of us could return to the original starting line. Time began to move differently after that call, no longer frantic, no longer suffocating. Days followed one another slowly, as if the land itself were deliberately pulling me back into its natural rhythm. Summer passed, leaving cooler mornings and shorter afternoons. I worked in the garden, repaired the fence on the west side, repainted the barn door. Small, repetitive tasks, but each time I finished one, I felt like I was laying another brick in my new piece. Ethan stopped calling. Not immediately. In the first few weeks, emails still came, forwarded from his lawyer, written in stiff language filled with familiar threatening phrases. Reconsider, dispute, legal rights. Rebecca handled all of it. She replied briefly, precisely, and left no opening. Whenever I asked, she simply said, "There's no progress, they have no case." Then the emails became less frequent. Eventually, they stopped. News about Claire reached me in a way I never expected, through a neighbor who stopped by to help fix a water pipe. He mentioned it casually, like small-town talk. Claire had moved out of the apartment the newlyweds had rented, just a few months after the wedding. I didn't ask for more details. I didn't need to. Later, there was a short email from Rebecca with a simple note attached, "For your awareness." It was a notice of legal separation filed by Claire. No flowery language, no long explanations, just dry, cold text, exactly like the way she had looked at me on the wedding day. I sat in front of the screen for a long time, reading those few lines over and over, not because I was happy, not because I was sad. I just felt empty. The emptiness of someone who had seen what they knew all along, but still hoped it wouldn't happen. Ethan lost his marriage before it ever had a chance to become a family, and with it, he lost the illusion that everything in life could be traded for plans and pressure. The legal threats disappeared completely after the first lawsuit was dismissed. No grounds, no legal interest, nothing to hold on to. Rebecca told me the other lawyer had advised Ethan to stop because the longer it dragged on, the more money he would lose, and the worse it would look if there were ever any future disputes. "He's paying the price," Rebecca said during a call, "and not just financially." I knew what she meant. I heard that Ethan had to sell the new car he'd bought to pay off debts. I heard he moved into a smaller apartment. None of that came from me, and I didn't go looking for it. It arrived on its own, like the natural consequences of a chain of bad choices. As for me, life slowly became peaceful again, in a way I had forgotten was possible. I began attending community meetings connected to the Conservation Trust, not as someone in charge, but as a contributor. I listened to young people talk about environmental protection, about nature education. I saw something in their eyes that I hadn't seen in my son's eyes for years: respect. The land began to change in very small, very real ways. A path was cleared so children could visit safely. One corner of the meadow was left untouched so wildflowers could keep blooming with the seasons. No concrete, no tall fences, just small wooden signs that read, "Conservation Area. Please tread lightly." The first time a group of children came to visit, I watched from a distance. They laughed, ran around, pointed when birds lifted from the edge of the woods. A young teacher explained the old oak tree to them, how it had been standing longer than their grandparents had been alive. I saw a little boy place his hand on the trunk, exactly the way Ethan used to when he was small. I turned away, not because it hurt, but because I understood. Life keeps going, even when it doesn't follow the shape we once imagined. In the evenings, I sat on the porch, drank tea, and watched the sun set behind the trees. No more constant phone calls, no more accusations, just insects, wind, and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I no longer lived in fear that someone would come take something from me tomorrow. Legacy, I realized, was never about money. It is the ability to say enough when greed starts to blur family ties. It is protecting values that can't be converted into profit. It is the courage to accept the loss of a relationship so you don't lose yourself. One afternoon, I received a message from Ethan. Just one short line: "Mom, I'm sorry." No explanation, no request, no plan. I read it, set the phone down, and didn't reply right away. I needed time, and this time I knew I had the right to it. I looked out at the land bathing in the last light of day. The children were gone. Nature had returned to its own rhythm. Everything was quiet. The price of greed had been paid. And the true value of legacy, not something to seize, but something to protect, finally stood clear and undeniable. The letter arrived on a very ordinary morning. Not an email, not a text. A cream-colored paper envelope, slightly thick, placed neatly in the wooden mailbox by the gate. My name was handwritten on it in a familiar yet unfamiliar script, slanted slightly to the right, a bit shaky, as if the writer had paused many times before each word. I held the envelope for a long time without opening it. I knew immediately it was from Ethan. I didn't need to see a return address. I didn't need any other sign. Some things, no matter how much time passes, a mother recognizes by a faint feeling deep in her chest. I brought the letter inside and set it on the kitchen table. Made tea, sat down. Morning sunlight streamed through the window, laying a thin stripe of light across the envelope. It was so quiet I could hear the wall clock ticking. I took a deep breath. Then I opened it. The paper inside was folded into thirds. Not expensive stationery, just ordinary letter paper, slightly wrinkled at the corners, as if it had been clenched and then smoothed out again. The first word tightened my chest. Mom. Just one word, but different from before. No demands, no blame, no pleading, just a raw, fragile address. Ethan wrote that he had lost many nights of sleep, that when everything collapsed, his marriage, his plans, the things he thought were certain, he finally began to look back at every step he had taken. He admitted that he had let others lead him, had let promises of an easy future blur the past. He wrote that Claire hadn't forced him with orders, but with carefully chosen words, that he believed it was maturity, a way of stepping out of his mother's shadow, that he hadn't realized that while trying to prove he was an independent man, he had betrayed the only person who had never turned her back on him. I read slowly, not skipping a single word. Ethan wrote about the wedding day, about the moment he saw me standing alone by the dessert table. He said he knew then that he was wrong, but he chose silence because he was afraid of upsetting his wife, afraid of damaging his image in front of others. He called it cowardice. His word, not mine. He wrote that when Claire left, he sat alone in the empty apartment and for the first time understood what it meant to be left behind. No one waiting for him to come home. No one asking if he had eaten. No one reminding him to wear an extra layer when it was cold. He wrote that in that moment he thought of me not as a controlling mother, but as a quiet presence he had always taken for granted. By then my hands were trembling. Ethan admitted that he had seen the land as an asset because he had never had to sweat to keep it. He wrote that he had confused the right to inherit with the right to take, that he hadn't understood that legacy is passed on with responsibility, not as an unconditional gift. Then came the part that made me stop. I've thought about everything over and over, and I realized something painful. The only person in my life who truly sacrificed, asked for nothing, never set conditions, was you. And you're the one I hurt the most. I folded the letter, not because I didn't want to keep reading, but because I couldn't. The tears came unexpectedly, not in a rush, not with sobs, just quiet drops falling onto the back of my hand, hot and heavy. It was the first time I had cried since the wedding, not from resentment, not from loss, but from something deeper, because at last my son had seen what I once feared he never would. I sat like that for a long time. The letter lay on the table. The tea had gone cold. Sunlight moved slowly across the floor. At the end of the letter, Ethan didn't ask for the land back. He didn't mention money. He didn't talk about plans. He only wrote that he was sorry, that he didn't expect forgiveness right away, that he only hoped that one day I might be able to look at him without pain. He signed his name, just his name, nothing else. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and put it into the desk drawer where I keep important papers, not to lock it away, but to let it be there, present, but not demanding. I wasn't ready to forgive, not because I didn't want to, but because forgiveness isn't a door that swings open just because an apology arrives at the right time. It's a long road, and I had gone too far down the path of protecting myself to return to the starting line immediately. That afternoon, I walked the land, a light breeze, clear sky. I stood beneath the old oak and placed my hand on its trunk, as I had done so many times before. I thought of Ethan as a child, of Marcus, of all the versions of myself who had passed through this place. I didn't know what the future would hold. Maybe one day I would answer the letter. Maybe I would invite Ethan here, not as an heir, but as a son, if he was patient enough to learn how to stand beside me again instead of across from me. Or maybe we would keep our distance, a distance not born of hatred but of healing. I didn't rush to decide. For the first time in many years, I allowed myself not to be the one who fixed everything right away. I allowed the future to remain open, not shaped by anyone else's wishes, but by a rhythm I could live with. The letter rested quietly in the drawer, and I, at last, allowed myself to breathe more slowly. My life after that wasn't dramatic, the way people often imagine when a family breaks apart like that. It was quiet, steady, and stronger than I ever expected. I woke each morning with sunlight filling the room. I made coffee, opened the door, stepped onto the porch, and took a deep breath of grass and damp earth. The land was still there, unchanged, needing no explanation. The oak still stood, the path still guided my steps along familiar rhythms. No one came to take anything away. No machines, no billboards, just the quiet continuation of nature and memory. I grew used to this peace, not the peace that comes when every relationship is perfect, but the peace that comes when you stop betraying yourself to hold on to things that are no longer love. I no longer jumped every time the phone rang. I no longer lived in fear that one firm decision would cost me everything. I had lost something, but I had kept something more important. The land now belongs to the Conservation Trust. Children come to learn about nature. Young people plant more trees, repair the paths, place small wooden signs that tell the history of this place. I am not the center of it all, and I don't need to be. I am simply part of the flow, just as my grandfather was, just as my father was, just as Marcus was. I came to understand that true legacy isn't about how much money you leave behind or who gets called an heir. Legacy is about what you choose to protect when you have the power to choose. It's about the values you refuse to sell, even when the price offered is tempting. And sometimes, the greatest legacy isn't what you give your children, but the lesson you force them to learn, even if it comes late. I still love Ethan. That didn't disappear just because he hurt me. But I no longer confuse love with unconditional sacrifice. I once believed that being a mother meant yielding until the end, staying silent to keep the peace, enduring so your child could be comfortable. I was wrong. Love does not mean letting others trample your boundaries, and protecting yourself is not selfish. Sometimes it is the most honest form of love, toward yourself and toward others. Some afternoons I sit beneath the old oak and watch sunlight filter through the leaves. I think about everyone who has passed through my life, the choices that brought me here. I no longer ask, what if? I don't wish to go back to any moment to change it. I walked my path, slow, painful, but right. If there is one thing I want to say to anyone listening to this story, it is this. You are not too old to set boundaries. You are not too late to choose yourself again, and you do not owe anyone a sacrifice that costs you your own worth. My life now is not grand, but it is real. It stands firm, and it belongs to me. If you're listening to this story, I would love to know, where are you watching from? From which city, or from what quiet corner of the world? Was there something in this story that felt like it was about you? If you were in my place, what would you do? Please share your thoughts in the comments. I read every line with gratitude. Thank you for staying until the end, for listening to my story with patience and empathy. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow so we can continue listening together to more stories about family, about boundaries, and about values that cannot be sold. I know that somewhere out there are people who are also learning how to stand upright again. And if this story helps you feel a little steadier, then everything I went through truly meant something.